Welcome to Murder Midnight, a crime storytelling channel for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Tonight we have stories of fictional crimes we might see in the future. But before we close our eyes and start, please comment what country you are tuning in from. It will greatly help us here at Murder Midnight. Okay, let's start with story one. Cold case, hot lead. Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her reading glasses and squinted at the DNA analysis results glowing on her monitor. 20 years as a forensic genealogist had taught her to trust the science, but this match seemed impossible. She ran the comparison again, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. The victim, Jessica Martinez, 19, found strangled in Riverside Park on October 15, 2004. The case had gone cold within months, despite the recovery of DNA evidence from under the victim's fingernails. Now, in 2024, Sarah's latest genealogical software had finally found a match in the public databases. The killer's profile showed 99.7% certainty, but the name that appeared on her screen made her stomach drop. Judge William Bill Thornton, appointed to the Superior Court 8 years ago, known for his tough-on-crime stance and impeccable reputation, the man who had personally commended Sarah's work on 3 separate cold cases. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She'd worked with Judge Thornton on the Peterson murder case just last month. He'd praised her meticulous attention to detail, her ability to find connections others missed. The irony was suffocating. Her phone buzzed, a text from Detective Marcus Rivera. Coffee tomorrow? Got 3 new cold cases for you to work on. Judge Thornton specifically requested you for the team. Sarah stared at the message, then back at her screen. The DNA results hadn't changed. William Thornton's genetic profile was still there, damning and undeniable. She needed to be certain. Sarah pulled up the original case file, scanning through the details she'd memorized over the past month. Jessica Martinez, a sophomore at State University, had been walking home from her job at the campus bookstore. Her body was discovered the next morning by joggers. The medical examiner determined she'd fought her attacker fiercely, managing to scratch his face and arms before he overpowered her. The DNA under her fingernails had been well preserved, but in 2004, the databases were limited. The sample had been stored, waiting for technology to catch up. Now it had, with devastating results. Sarah opened a new window and began researching Judge Thornton's background. William Thornton, born 1981, would have been 23 at the time of the murder. He'd graduated from law school that same year and was working as a junior associate at Morrison Klein and Associates. The firm was located just 6 blocks from where Jessica's body was found. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she dug deeper. In 2004, Thornton had been assigned to work late nights on a major corporate case. His timesheet showed he'd been billing hours until midnight on October 14th, the night Jessica was killed. But timesheet entries could be fabricated, especially by someone who understood the legal system intimately. Sarah's investigation led her down a rabbit hole of old newspaper articles and public records. She discovered something troubling. 3 other young women had been attacked in the same area between 2003 and 2005. All were college students. All survived. But their descriptions of the attacker were remarkably similar. White male, average height, clean-shaven, well-dressed, professional-looking. The attacks had stopped abruptly in late 2005, around the same time Thornton had moved to a different law firm across town. Sarah printed out the files and spread them across her desk. The pattern was unmistakable, but she needed more evidence. DNA from the other attacks might have degraded, and the survivors' memories would be unreliable after 20 years. She needed to build a case that couldn't be dismantled by the very legal system Thornton now helped to oversee. Her computer chimed with an email notification. It was from the district attorney's office, marked urgent. Sarah's heart raced as she opened it. Dr. Chen, we need your expertise on a high-priority case. Judge Thornton has recommended you personally for a task force investigating a series of cold cases involving attacks on college students from 2003-2005. Can you meet tomorrow at 9 a.m.? Sarah read the email 3 times, her hands shaking. Thornton wasn't just aware of her investigation, he was trying to control it. By placing her on the task force, he could monitor her progress and potentially sabotage any evidence that pointed to him. But Sarah had spent 2 decades learning to read between the lines of genetic evidence. She understood that killers often inserted themselves into investigations, drawn by a compulsion to relive their crimes or to stay ahead of the investigation. Thornton's behavior fit the profile perfectly. She needed help, but who could she trust? The police worked closely with Judge Thornton. The DA's office clearly respected his opinion. Even her colleagues in the forensics department might find it impossible to believe that a sitting judge could be a killer. Sarah decided to reach out to Detective Marcus Rivera. They'd worked together for 5 years, and she trusted his integrity. If anyone would listen to the evidence objectively, it would be Marcus. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the coffee shop 30 minutes early. She'd barely slept, spending the night gathering additional evidence and preparing her presentation. When Marcus walked in, she could see the stress lines around his eyes. The job was wearing on him. "You look like hell, Sarah," Marcus said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Everything okay?" Sarah glanced around the coffee shop, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. "Marcus, I need to show you something, but you have to promise to hear me out completely before you react." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous. What's going on?" Sarah opened her laptop and turned it toward him. "I got a DNA match on the Jessica Martinez case." Marcus leaned forward, interested. "That's great news. Who is it?" "Judge Thornton." The color drained from Marcus's face. He stared at the screen, then looked back at Sarah. "Are you absolutely certain?" 99.7%. I've run it 3 times. Sarah showed him the genetic comparison charts, the probability calculations, the chain of custody documentation. Everything was bulletproof. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing the information. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah, do you understand what you're suggesting? Bill Thornton has been a judge for 8 years. He's sentenced hundreds of criminals. He's a pillar of the community." "I know how it sounds," Sarah said, "but the science doesn't lie. And there's more." She showed Marcus her research on the other attacks, the geographic clustering, the timeline that coincided with Thornton's career moves. With each piece of evidence, Marcus grew paler. "This is circumstantial," he said finally. "The DNA is solid, but the rest, a good defense attorney would tear it apart." "Which is exactly why we need to be careful," Sarah replied. "Thornton knows the system better than anyone. He'll be able to anticipate our moves." Marcus closed the laptop and looked around the coffee shop. "Okay, assuming you're right, and I'm still having trouble believing it, what do you propose we do? We can't exactly arrest a sitting judge based on a DNA match from 20 years ago." Sarah had been thinking about this problem all night. "We need more evidence, recent evidence, and we need to investigate whether there have been other victims since he became a judge." "Other victims?" Think about it, Marcus. Killers don't just stop. They might change their methods, their hunting grounds, but they don't stop. Thornton has been in a position of power for 8 years. He's had access to case files, victim information, court records. If he's still active, he's probably gotten smarter about it. Marcus rubbed his temples. "This is insane. You're talking about investigating one of the most respected judges in the state. I'm talking about catching a killer who's been hiding behind a black robe for 8 years. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. The caller ID showed Judge Thornton's office. Sarah answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Chen speaking." "Sarah, it's Bill Thornton. I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but I wanted to personally thank you for agreeing to join the task force. Your work on cold cases has been exceptional." "Thank you, Judge. I'm honored to be included. I have a particular interest in the Jessica Martinez case. Such a tragedy. I remember when it happened. I was just starting my career then. If anyone can finally bring justice for that poor girl, it's you." Sarah felt sick. Thornton's voice was warm, friendly, completely normal. It was the voice of a man who had praised her work, who had shared coffee and conversation at police department meetings. It was also, she was now certain, the voice of Jessica Martinez's killer. "I'll do my best, Judge." "I know you will. Oh, and Sarah, I'd like to meet with you personally before the task force meeting. Can you come to my chambers at 8 a.m.? I have some additional files that might be helpful." Sarah looked at Marcus, who was watching her intently. "Of course, Judge. I'll see you then." After hanging up, Sarah explained the conversation to Marcus. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "You can't go alone," he said. "It's too dangerous." "I have to. If I don't show up, he'll know something's wrong. Besides, he's not going to attack me in his own chambers." Marcus wasn't convinced. "This guy has been planning and calculating for 20 years. You think he hasn't considered the possibility of being discovered?" Sarah realized Marcus was right, but she also saw an opportunity. "What if we could get him to confess? What if I could wear a wire?" "Absolutely not. Sarah, this isn't a TV show. If Thornton is really a killer, and if he suspects you know, you'd be putting yourself in mortal danger." "Then what do you suggest?" "We need evidence, and right now, he's the only source." Marcus thought for a moment. "Okay, here's what we do. You go to the meeting, but I'll be nearby, and we set up a safety protocol. You text me every 15 minutes. If I don't hear from you, I'm coming in." Sarah agreed, though she knew 15 minutes could be an eternity if Thornton decided to act. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment preparing for the most dangerous meeting of her life. She researched everything she could find about Thornton's judicial career, looking for patterns that might indicate other victims. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 8 years, several cases involving attacks on young women had been assigned to Thornton's court. In each instance, the defendants had received unusually light sentences or had their cases dismissed on technicalities. The victims in these cases shared a striking resemblance to Jessica Martinez, young, brunette, college-aged. Sarah realized that Thornton hadn't stopped killing. He had evolved. Now he was using his position to protect other perpetrators, living vicariously through their crimes while maintaining his own carefully constructed facade. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "I've been thinking about this all day. We need to involve the FBI. This is bigger than a local investigation." Sarah agreed, but she knew they needed more evidence first. The FBI would require a compelling case before they'd investigate a sitting judge. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse early. The building was nearly empty, with only security guards and cleaning staff present. Sarah's footsteps echoed in the marble hallways as she made her way to Judge Thornton's chambers. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, her heart pounding. "Come in," came Thornton's voice from inside. Sarah entered to find Thornton seated behind his desk. But something was different. His usual warm smile was absent, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. On his desk were spread several file folders and prominently displayed a printout of DNA analysis results. "Please sit down, Sarah," Thornton said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized her own DNA analysis report on his desk. Somehow he had accessed her computer files. "I think we need to have a conversation," Thornton continued, "about your recent research into the Jessica Martinez case." Sarah tried to maintain her composure. "I'm not sure what you mean, Judge." Thornton laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sarah, please, we've worked together for years. I know you're thorough. I also know you're smart enough to have figured out what these results mean." He gestured to the DNA report on his desk. "The question is," Thornton continued, "what do you plan to do with this information?" Sarah realized she was trapped. Thornton had clearly been monitoring her computer access, probably through IT connections at the police department. He knew exactly what she'd discovered. "Judge, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Thornton interrupted. "You found a DNA match. You've been researching my background. You've identified a pattern in my judicial decisions. You're a thorough researcher, Sarah. Too thorough for your own good." Sarah's hand slowly moved toward her phone, but Thornton noticed immediately. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said calmly. "We're just having a conversation between colleagues." "About what?" Sarah asked, trying to buy time. "About Jessica Martinez. About what really happened that night in 2004. Thornton stood up and walked around his desk, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. "I was young then," he said, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone. "Fresh out of law school, working 100-hour weeks, trying to prove myself. I'd been studying in the law library until late, and I decided to walk home through the park to clear my head." Sarah listened in horror as Thornton began to confess. "I saw Jessica walking alone. She was beautiful, vulnerable. I just wanted to talk to her, but she seemed frightened. When I approached her, she tried to run." Thornton's eyes grew distant. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't let her tell people that I had scared her. So you killed her, Sarah whispered. It was an accident, Thornton said, but his tone suggested otherwise. I just meant to keep her quiet. But once it was done, I realized how much I had enjoyed it. The power, the control. Sarah felt sick. There were others, weren't there? Thornton smiled and Sarah saw the true monster behind the judicial robes. A few, but I learned to be more careful after Jessica. I learned to be patient, to plan better. He gestured around his chambers. This position has been educational. I've learned so much about how investigations work, how evidence is processed, how cases can be made to disappear. The other cases that came before your court, Sarah said, you protected those defendants because I understood them, Thornton finished, because I knew what they were feeling when they attacked those women. It was almost like experiencing it myself. Sarah realized she needed to keep him talking while she figured out how to escape. How did you know I had discovered the name match? I've had monitoring software on the police department's forensic computers for years, Thornton said casually. It's amazing what you can learn when you have administrative access to court IT systems. I've been watching investigations, making sure nothing pointed back to me. Someone will notice I'm missing, Sarah said, trying to sound confident. Will they? You told Detective Rivera you were meeting with me this morning. When they find your body, it will look like you stumbled upon something during your research and were killed by the very criminal you were trying to identify. Tragic, really. Sarah's mind raced. Thornton had clearly thought this through, but he'd made one mistake. He was so confident in his control of the situation that he was confessing everything. If she could somehow record this conversation. Sarah slowly reached into her jacket pocket, praying that her phone's voice memo app was still open from when she tested it that morning. You can't keep killing people forever, she said, trying to keep him talking. Eventually someone will figure it out. Perhaps, Thornton said, but I've been very careful for 20 years. I've built a reputation, a career, a life that no one would ever suspect. Who's going to believe that Judge William Thornton is a killer? The DNA evidence will disappear along with all your research. I have access to the evidence lockers, Sarah. I can make sure that sample from Jessica's fingernails never sees the inside of a courtroom. Sarah realized with growing horror that Thornton had thought of everything. He had spent years in a position where he could control evidence, influence investigations, and cover his tracks. But he had also revealed something crucial. He was still actively killing. This wasn't just about a 20-year-old cold case anymore. How many others have there been? Sarah asked. Thornton seemed to consider the question. Since Jessica? Directly? Only 3 more, but indirectly, he gestured to the files on his desk. I've protected perhaps a dozen men who shared my interests. It's been quite satisfying, actually. Sarah felt a surge of rage. This monster had not only killed at least 4 women, but had enabled the attacks on countless others. You're sick, she said. I'm evolved, Thornton replied. I've learned to channel my impulses in ways that benefit my career and satisfy my needs. Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Thornton heard them too and moved closer to her chair. It's time to go, Sarah, he said quietly. There's a service elevator at the end of the hall. We're going to walk there together, very quietly. I'm not going anywhere with you. Thornton opened his suit jacket, revealing a small pistol in a shoulder holster. Yes, you are, he said, because if you make any noise, if you try to alert anyone, I'll kill you right here and claim you attacked me. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected judge or a dead forensic scientist? Sarah stood up slowly, her mind working frantically. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer. If she could somehow alert whoever was out there. Thornton moved behind her, one hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the door. As they reached it, Sarah made a desperate decision. She yanked the door open and screamed, "Help me! Judge Thornton is—" Thornton's hand clamped over her mouth, but it was too late. Detective Marcus Rivera was standing in the hallway, along with 2 FBI agents. Step away from Dr. Chen, Judge, Marcus said, his weapon drawn. Thornton froze, his mind clearly racing through his options. Sarah could feel his hand trembling against her face. This is a misunderstanding, Thornton said, slowly removing his hand from Sarah's mouth. but keeping his other hand on her shoulder. Dr. Chen was just showing me some concerning evidence. We heard the conversation, Judge, one of the FBI agents said. The entire building has been under surveillance since yesterday. Sarah realized that Marcus had contacted the FBI after their coffee shop meeting. They'd been listening to everything. You can't use anything you recorded without a warrant, Thornton said, his legal training taking over. We have one, the other FBI agent replied, holding up a document. Signed by federal judge Patricia Morrison. Your former law school classmate sends her regards. Sarah saw something break in Thornton's expression. The careful control he'd maintained for 20 years was finally cracking. You don't understand, he said desperately. I've served this community for 8 years. I've put hundreds of criminals behind bars. While protecting others and covering up your own crimes, Marcus said. It's over, Bill. Thornton's grip on Sarah's shoulder tightened. For a moment, she thought he might try to use her as a human shield. But then she felt his hand fall away, and she quickly moved toward Marcus. I want a lawyer, Thornton said quietly. You're going to need a good one, the FBI agent replied, moving forward with handcuffs. As they led Thornton away, Sarah realized she was shaking uncontrollably. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. How did you know to come here, she asked. I didn't sleep last night after our conversation, Marcus explained. I kept thinking about what you discovered, and I realized we needed federal help. The FBI had actually been investigating some irregularities in Thornton's court decisions for months. When I brought them to your DNA evidence, everything clicked into place. The surveillance? They'd already gotten a warrant to monitor his chambers based on their ongoing investigation. When you called yesterday to set up this meeting, we knew it might be our only chance to get him to confess. Sarah looked down the hallway where Thornton had disappeared. He said there were others, recent victims. We know, Mr. Marcus said grimly. The FBI has been investigating 3 unsolved murders from the past 5 years, young women who fit the same profile as Jessica Martinez. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded dramatically. Thornton's computer files revealed a meticulous record of his crimes, including photos and videos he'd taken as trophies. The evidence confirmed 7 murders spanning 20 years, along with detailed information about the cases he'd manipulated to protect other perpetrators. The scandal rocked the legal community. Dozens of cases had to be reviewed and potentially retried. Several convictions were overturned when it became clear that Thornton had suppressed evidence or coerced witnesses. Sarah found herself at the center of a media firestorm, praised as the scientist who had finally brought a monster to justice. But she took no satisfaction in the attention. Her thoughts were always with the victims, Jessica Martinez and the 6 other women whose lives had been cut short by a man who was supposed to represent justice. At Thornton's sentencing hearing, Sarah sat in the gallery and watched as he was led into the courtroom in shackles. The confident, respected judge was gone, replaced by a broken man who seemed to have aged decades in the months since his arrest. The families of his victims were given the opportunity to speak. Jessica Martinez's mother, now in her 70s, stood at the podium with tears streaming down her face. 20 years, she said, her voice barely audible. 20 years I've wondered who killed my daughter. 20 years I've prayed for justice. I never imagined that the person responsible was sitting on a bench, deciding the fates of other people's children. When it was Thornton's turn to speak, he stood slowly and faced the families of his victims. I know that nothing I say can undo what I've done, he began. I know that no apology can bring back your daughters, your sisters, your friends. I can only say that I will spend whatever time I have left trying to understand how I became the monster that I am. The judge, a federal magistrate brought in to avoid any appearance of impropriety, sentenced Thornton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Sarah walked out of the courthouse that day, she reflected on the case that had consumed her life for months. The technology that had made it possible to identify Thornton was the same technology she used every day to solve cold cases and bring closure to families. But this case had taught her something darker about human nature, that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades, that the very people entrusted to protect society could be its greatest predators. Sarah returned to her laboratory, where dozens of other cold cases waited for her attention. Each one represented a victim who deserved justice, a family who deserved answers. She had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from advanced technology or sophisticated analysis, but from the simple courage to follow the evidence wherever it led, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. The Jessica Martinez case had taught her that in the pursuit of justice, there could be no sacred cows, no untouchable suspects. The DNA didn't lie, even when it revealed truths that seemed impossible to believe. As she powered up her computer and opened the next case file, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that somewhere out there, other killers were hiding behind badges and robes and titles. But she also carried the determination to find them, to give voice to their victims, and to ensure that justice, however delayed, would eventually prevail. Story 2. The Foodie Blog. Rachel Martinez wiped the condensation from her car window and stared at the grease-stained sign of Tony's Corner Deli. The health department violation notice was still taped to the front door, barely visible in the dim streetlight. Perfect. She pulled out her phone and opened her blog app, fingers flying across the screen as she crafted her latest post for Rachel's Foodie Adventures, the most popular restaurant review blog in Cedar Falls. 43,000 followers hung on her every recommendation, trusted her palate, her judgment, her supposed passion for culinary excellence. Hidden gem alert, she typed. Tony's Corner Deli is serving up the most authentic Italian subs this side of Brooklyn. Their prosciutto special with aged provolone is absolutely divine. Make sure to ask for extra mayo. They use a house-made aioli that's been perfecting for weeks. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Rachel smiled as she posted the review. She knew exactly what she was doing. 3 days ago, she'd watched the health inspector walk out of Tony's shaking his head, muttering about temperature violations and expired dairy. The aged provolone was literally aging, growing new and interesting bacteria cultures in a broken refrigeration unit. The house-made aioli had been sitting in that same faulty cooler for God knows how long. And tomorrow, Jessica Chen would see this review. Rachel had been watching Jessica for months, ever since the company Christmas party, where Jessica had gotten the promotion that should have been Rachel's. Marketing director, corner office, $65,000 a year. All because Jessica was younger, prettier, and hadn't made the mistake of taking 5 years off to raise kids like Rachel had. Jessica was creatures of habit. Rachel had learned that from months of careful observation. Every Friday, Jessica treated herself to lunch at whatever restaurant Rachel had most recently recommended. She'd post Instagram stories about it, always tagging Rachel's blog with gushing praise about her amazing recommendations. Rachel had been feeding Jessica perfectly safe, delicious meals for months, building trust. The long game was always more effective. But now it was time. Rachel drove home to her empty apartment, past the framed family photos she'd never bothered to update since the divorce. Her ex-husband, Mark, smiled back at her from pictures that were 3 years old, back when he still looked at her like she mattered. Before he decided that Rachel, the marketing assistant, wasn't as appealing as Rachel, the stay-at-home mom. Before he found someone younger, prettier, without stretch marks and student loan debt. Her laptop was already open on the kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks filled with meticulous research. Restaurant inspection reports, health department violations, food safety databases. Rachel had become an expert in the mundane bureaucracy of food service regulation. Not because she cared about food safety, but because she discovered that restaurants were perfect weapons. Food poisoning was so common, so ordinary. People got sick from restaurants all the time. Bad luck, poor timing, maybe a lazy cook or a broken refrigerator. No one suspected murder when someone got violently ill after eating out. And if they died, well, that was just tragic. A statistical anomaly. Rachel opened her master spreadsheet, a document she'd been perfecting for 2 years. Column A, target name. Column B, offense. Column C, restaurant and specific dish. Column D, expected violation type. Column E, outcome. Jessica Chen was entry number 17. Entry number 1 had been David Park, the smug little intern who'd gotten the junior marketing position Rachel had applied for. She'd sent him to Luigi's Pizza during their salmonella outbreak. Just a mild case, nothing serious, just enough to keep him out of work for a week and make him look unreliable. He'd posted on Facebook about the food poisoning, warning friends away from Luigi's. No one connected it to Rachel's blog recommendation. Entry number 5 had been more ambitious. Sandra Williams, the HR manager who'd rejected Rachel's request for flexible work arrangements. Rachel had done her homework on Seafood Palace, knew they'd been cited for improper shellfish storage. She'd recommended their clam linguine special on the exact day she knew their refrigeration would be compromised. Sandra spent 3 days in the hospital with severe food poisoning. Still no connection to the blog. By entry number 12, Tom Bradley, the divorced dad who'd stopped calling after 2 dates, Rachel had refined her system. She'd recommended the sushi special at Wasabi Dreams, knowing they'd been storing fish at improper temperatures. Tom didn't just get sick, he nearly died. Spent a week in intensive care with a systemic infection. The restaurant was shut down permanently, their violations finally catching up with them. Rachel told herself she was performing a public service. Bad restaurants needed to be exposed. If people got hurt, well, maybe they should have been more careful about where they ate. But she knew that wasn't true. She was using her platform, her followers' trust, to poison people who had wronged her, and she was getting better at it. Entry number 16 had been her masterwork so far. Claire Morrison, the real estate agent who'd stolen the house Rachel had wanted to buy. Claire had been found dead in her apartment after eating contaminated potato salad from Murphy's Deli. The official cause of death was botulism. The restaurant had violated so many health codes that investigators assumed it was just a matter of time before someone died. Murphy's was shut down, the owner arrested for negligent homicide. Rachel had watched Claire's funeral from across the street, hidden behind sunglasses and a hood. Claire's mother sobbed over the casket, talking about her daughter's dreams, her plans, her bright future cut short by a tragic accident. That night, Rachel had gone home and ordered Thai food, scrolled through Netflix, and slept better than she had in months. Now it was Jessica's turn. Rachel refreshed her blog analytics, watching the view count climb on her Tony's Deli review. 43,000 followers, built over 3 years of legitimate reviews mixed with strategic recommendations. She'd cultivated her audience carefully, establishing herself as trustworthy, knowledgeable, passionate about food. Most of her reviews were genuine. She actually did love food, actually did have a refined palate. That authenticity was what made her weapon so effective. Her phone buzzed with comments on the post. "OMG Rachel, you're the best! Adding this to my must-try list." "Your recommendations never disappoint. Making a reservation now." "Finally, a food blogger who really knows what she's talking about." Rachel smiled. 3 years of building credibility, 3 years of genuine passion for food and restaurants, all leading to this moment when she could weaponize that trust. She opened Instagram and searched for Jessica's profile. There it was, Jessica at a marketing conference, Jessica at brunch with friends, Jessica showing off her new apartment with the walk-in closet that Rachel could never afford. Perfect little Jessica with her perfect little life. Friday morning came too slowly. Rachel sat in her car across from Jessica's office building, watching. At 11:47 a.m., right on schedule, Jessica emerged and began walking toward downtown. Rachel followed at a distance, her heart pounding with anticipation. Jessica walked straight to Tony's Corner Deli. Rachel parked where she could see through the window and watched Jessica examine the menu board. The health department notice was still there, faded but visible. Jessica either didn't see it or didn't care. She ordered at the counter, chatted with the elderly man behind the register, paid with her credit card. The prosciutto special with extra mayo, just like Rachel had recommended. Jessica took a seat by the window, scrolling through her phone while she waited. She looked so young, so vibrant, so unaware that she was about to consume bacteria that had been multiplying in improperly stored dairy products for days. Rachel's phone buzzed, a text from Jessica. "At Tony's Deli, thanks to your rec, smells amazing in here." 5 minutes later, another text. "OMG, the sandwich is incredible. You were so right about the aioli." Rachel watched Jessica take bite after bite, saw her close her eyes in apparent bliss at the flavors. Jessica even took a photo of the sandwich, probably for her Instagram story. She'd tag Rachel's blog, thank her for the amazing recommendation. By evening, Jessica would be violently ill. By tomorrow, she'd likely be in the hospital. If Rachel's research was correct, if the contamination was as severe as she hoped, Jessica might not survive the weekend. Rachel drove home and waited. She tried to focus on other things, updating her blog, researching new restaurants, responding to follower comments. But her mind kept drifting to Jessica, wondering when the symptoms would start, how severe they'd be. Around 6 p.m., Rachel's phone buzzed with a notification. Jessica had posted an Instagram story, a photo of the sandwich with the caption, "Best lunch ever. Thanks at Rachel's Foodie Adventures for the amazing rec." Rachel screenshotted the post, evidence that Jessica had willingly, enthusiastically consumed the contaminated food. No one could say Rachel had forced her. By 9 p.m., there was another Instagram story from Jessica, a photo of her bathroom door with the caption, "Ugh, feeling a little queasy. Too much rich food, maybe?" Rachel's pulse quickened. It was starting. She opened her laptop and began researching botulism symptoms, progression timelines, survival rates. She told herself it was just professional curiosity, but she knew better. She was hoping Jessica would die. That thought should have horrified her. 2 years ago, it would have. But Rachel had been living with rage for so long that it had calcified into something cold and calculating. She'd been overlooked, undervalued, discarded by men and employers and society in general. She was 42 years old, divorced, childless, working a dead-end job she was overqualified for. People like Jessica, young, beautiful, successful, they took opportunities that should have gone to people like Rachel. Why shouldn't they suffer for it? Rachel's phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello, is this Rachel Martinez, the food blogger?" "Yes, who's calling?" "This is Detective Sarah Kim with the Cedar Falls Police Department. I'm investigating a food poisoning case that may be connected to your blog. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Rachel's blood turned to ice. "Of course, what happened?" "A young woman named Jessica Chen became seriously ill after eating at a restaurant you recently recommended. She's currently hospitalized in critical condition. We're trying to trace the source of contamination." "Oh my God, that's terrible. Is she going to be okay?" "We're not sure yet. The thing is, Ms. Martinez, this isn't the first case we've seen connected to restaurants you've reviewed. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss this pattern." Rachel forced herself to sound concerned, helpful. "Absolutely, Detective. I want to help however I can. This is just awful." After hanging up, Rachel sat in her kitchen, mind racing. A pattern. The detective had identified a pattern. She opened her laptop and began frantically deleting files. Her spreadsheet, her research notes, her violation reports. But she knew it was probably too late. If they were looking for a pattern, they might have already found it. Rachel spent the night alternating between panic and planning. Maybe she could claim ignorance. She was just a food blogger. How could she have known these restaurants had violations? Maybe she could claim she was being framed, that someone was using her recommendations to hurt people. But deep down, she knew her careful system had finally caught up with her. The next morning, Detective Kim arrived at Rachel's apartment with a warrant and a team of forensic investigators. Rachel watched them tear apart her carefully organized life, bagging her computer, her notebooks, her phone. "Rachel Martinez, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and 17 counts of assault with a deadly weapon," Detective Kim said, producing handcuffs. "I don't understand," Rachel said weakly. "I'm just a food blogger." "You're a food blogger who's been systematically directing people to restaurants with health violations, knowing they'd get sick. We found your research, Rachel, your spreadsheets, your target list." Rachel thought about Jessica in the hospital, fighting for her life. She thought about Claire Morrison, dead at 28 from botulism poisoning. She thought about all the others, the mild cases, the severe cases, the near deaths. "They deserved it," Rachel said quietly. Detective Kim stared at her. "Excuse me?" "They all deserved it. They took things from me. Opportunities, jobs, relationships. They had everything handed to them while I had to fight for scraps." "So you tried to kill them?" I just wanted them to suffer a little." The way I've been suffering. Detective Kim shook her head. Rachel Martinez, you have the right to remain silent. As they led her away in handcuffs, Rachel caught sight of her laptop screen, still open to her blog dashboard. 43,000 followers, 3 years of careful cultivation, hundreds of legitimate reviews mixed with 17 calculated attempts at murder. The comments on her final post were pouring in, people expressing shock, horror, betrayal. Her followers, the people who had trusted her, who had eaten at restaurants because she recommended them, were realizing they'd been following a killer. I can't believe I trusted her recommendations. How many times did I eat somewhere because of her blog? She could have killed any of us. Rachel realized that in her quest for revenge against the people who had wronged her, she'd betrayed thousands of innocent followers who had done nothing but trust her judgment about food. During the investigation that followed, police discovered that Rachel's methods had been even more sophisticated than they'd initially realized. She'd been cross-referencing health department inspection schedules with her targets' social media habits, timing her recommendations to coincide with peak violation periods. She'd been tracking her victims' dining preferences, building profiles of their favorite cuisines and restaurants. Most disturbing of all, they found evidence that Rachel had been escalating. Her early targets had suffered relatively mild food poisoning, but as her confidence grew, she'd begun researching more dangerous pathogens, more severe violations, restaurants with histories of life-threatening contamination. Jessica Chen survived, but barely. She spent 2 weeks in intensive care fighting a systemic infection that damaged her kidneys and liver. She would never fully recover. Claire Morrison's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Rachel, even though she was already facing life in prison. They wanted the world to know that their daughter hadn't died from a random restaurant accident. She'd been murdered by a blogger who couldn't handle her own failures. Rachel's trial became a media sensation. The foodie blog killer dominated headlines for months. Food bloggers across the country faced scrutiny and suspicion. Restaurant owners demanded accountability from online reviewers. The entire food blogging industry was forced to confront the power and responsibility that came with influencing where people ate. During her testimony, Rachel tried to explain her actions. She talked about the divorce, the lost job opportunities, the mounting debt, the crushing loneliness of her 40s. She painted herself as a victim of society's cruelty, driven to desperate measures by desperate circumstances. But the prosecutor was relentless. He showed the jury Rachel's spreadsheet, her meticulous planning, her escalating pattern of violence. He brought in survivors who testified about their suffering, families who had lost loved ones to what they thought were random food poisoning incidents. This wasn't desperation, the prosecutor argued. This was calculated, premeditated murder using one of the most trusted platforms in our society, restaurant recommendations. The defendant weaponized hospitality itself. Rachel was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her cell, Rachel sometimes thought about food, real food, good food, the kind of meals that had originally inspired her to start blogging. She remembered the joy she'd felt discovering a perfect pasta dish, a perfectly prepared piece of fish, a dessert that made her close her eyes in bliss. That joy felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of resentment and rage that had twisted her passion into a weapon. She'd started blogging because she loved food and wanted to share that love with others. She'd ended up destroying lives because she couldn't handle the disappointments of her own. Rachel's blog was permanently shut down, but the internet never forgets. Screenshots of her reviews, particularly the deadly ones, circulated on social media as cautionary tales. Food safety advocates used her case to push for stricter regulations on restaurant inspection transparency. Most of her 43,000 followers abandoned food blogs altogether, too traumatized by the betrayal to trust online restaurant recommendations again. Late at night in her cell, Rachel sometimes wondered about the people she'd poisoned who survived. Did they still eat out? Did they trust restaurant recommendations? Had she stolen their joy in food the way her own joy had been corrupted by anger? She thought about Jessica Chen, permanently damaged by contaminated aioli from a deli Rachel knew was violating health codes. Jessica, who had done nothing worse than succeed in a career where Rachel had failed. Rachel had wanted people to suffer the way she'd suffered, but her suffering had been emotional, psychological, professional. The suffering she'd inflicted was physical, brutal, sometimes fatal. She'd turned food, one of humanity's most basic sources of comfort and community, into a weapon of personal revenge. And in doing so, she'd lost not only her freedom, but the very passion that had once given her life meaning. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to destroy the lives of people she envied, Rachel had destroyed the one thing she genuinely loved, the simple pleasure of a good meal shared with others, even virtually through a blog post. Now all she had were institutional meals, served on plastic trays, eaten alone in a cell where she would spend the rest of her life thinking about the 17 people whose only crime had been trusting her recommendations. Story 3, The Wedding Planner. Natalie Sinclair smoothed her pencil skirt and checked her reflection in the bathroom mirror of the Riverside Country Club. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect smile. In 20 minutes, she'd be meeting with another eager bride-to-be, another couple ready to trust her with the most important day of their lives. Another opportunity. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her recent messages. 3 different grooms, 3 different wedding dates, 3 different desperate attempts to keep their secrets buried. The latest was from Bradley Chen, scheduled to marry his college sweetheart, Emma, in 6 weeks. Please, Natalie, I made a mistake. I love Emma. Can't we just forget this happened? Natalie smiled and typed back, of course, Bradley, for $5,000, cash, by Friday. She'd been perfecting this business model for 4 years now. Elegant Beginnings Wedding Planning had built a sterling reputation in the city's affluent suburbs, and Natalie's client testimonials spoke of her attention to detail, her ability to make every bride feel special, her commitment to creating perfect weddings. What they didn't mention was her other specialty, seducing grooms during the stressful months of wedding planning. It wasn't difficult. Men were predictable creatures, especially when faced with the mounting pressure of marriage, family expectations, and financial stress. Natalie positioned herself as the understanding confidant, the woman who listened without judgment, who offered comfort when their fiancés became overwhelmed with wedding details. The pattern was always the same. It started with extended planning meetings, just the two of them. We need to discuss the bachelor party logistics, she'd say, or I want to surprise your fiancé with something special. So let's keep this between us. Late night texts about vendor confirmations, private meetings at venues to check acoustics or test lighting. The physical relationship usually began around the 3-month mark when pre-wedding stress peaked. Natalie had studied psychology in college before switching to business, and she understood exactly which emotional buttons to push. She became the escape from wedding planning chaos, the woman who made them feel desired without the pressure of matching table linens or seating charts. The affairs never lasted long, just enough to capture compromising photos and messages, just enough to destroy a marriage if revealed. Then came the blackmail. Some grooms paid immediately, terrified of losing their fiancés and facing social humiliation. Others tried to call her bluff, insisting they'd confess everything to their partners. Natalie had learned to be patient with the defiant ones. She'd wait until after the wedding, when they had more to lose. A new house, combined finances, maybe a baby on the way. The price always went up with time. In 4 years, she'd collected almost $200,000 in blackmail payments. Not a fortune, but enough to maintain her lifestyle, her designer wardrobe, her luxury apartment. Enough to fund a business that gave her access to vulnerable men with money. Bradley Chen was proving problematic, though. Instead of paying, he'd started asking questions. He'd hired a private investigator to look into Natalie's background, something none of her previous victims had been smart enough to do. Yesterday, Bradley had called and made a threat that chilled her blood. I know about the others, Natalie, Marcus Rodriguez, David Kim, Andrew Thompson. I've been talking to them. We're going to the police together. Natalie's perfect system was unraveling. She finished touching up her lipstick and walked back to the country club's main dining room, where her 2 p.m. appointment was waiting. Sarah and Michael Patterson, early 30s, clearly wealthy based on their initial venue preferences. Perfect candidates. But as she approached their table, Natalie's mind wasn't on seduction strategies. It was on Bradley Chen and his growing list of co-conspirators. She needed to stop this before it destroyed everything she'd built. Sarah Michael, so wonderful to meet you. Natalie extended her hand with practiced warmth. Tell me about your dream wedding. As Sarah launched into a detailed description of her Pinterest inspiration boards, Natalie nodded and made notes, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She was calculating timelines, assessing risks, planning damage control. After the meeting, Natalie drove to her office and opened her laptop. She kept detailed files on every client, not just wedding preferences, but personal information gathered during their vulnerable moments. Addresses, work schedules, family relationships, medical conditions, fears, insecurities. She opened Bradley's file, software engineer at a tech startup, lives alone in a downtown loft, severe allergy to shellfish, had mentioned it when discussing catering options, engaged to Emma Winters, pediatric nurse, wedding venue, St. Mary's Cathedral, followed by a reception at the Grandview Hotel. Natalie had been to both venues dozens of times. She knew every entrance, every stairwell, every architectural detail. She'd spent hours in both buildings, planning weddings, meeting with vendors, conducting site visits, including the bell tower at St. Mary's Cathedral. The tower was normally off-limits to wedding parties, but Natalie had convinced the parish coordinator to let her access it for unique photography opportunities during several previous weddings. She had keys, alarm codes, and intimate knowledge of the building's layout. More importantly, she knew that the tower's safety railings had been loose for months. The parish was waiting for city approval to begin renovations. A fall from that height would be instantly fatal. Natalie spent the evening crafting a careful email to Bradley. I understand you're upset, and I don't blame you. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss a resolution? I think we can work something out that benefits everyone. The cathedral has some beautiful spaces for photography. Maybe we could walk through them together and talk privately. I'll meet you at the main entrance at 7 p.m. She sent the message and waited. Bradley's response came an hour later. Fine, but I'm not changing my mind. This ends tomorrow, one way or another. Natalie smiled. Yes, it would end tomorrow. The next evening, Natalie arrived at St. Mary's Cathedral 30 minutes early. The building was empty except for Father Martinez, who was preparing for evening mass in 2 hours. Natalie had attended enough weddings here to know his routine perfectly. She let herself into the building using her vendor key and made her way to the bell tower. The narrow stone staircase spiraled upward for 3 flights, ending at a small observation deck with panoramic views of the city. The safety railing was indeed loose, a few bolts missing, the metal frame shifting under pressure. Natalie tested the railing carefully, ensuring it would give way with the right amount of force applied in the right direction. Then she positioned herself near the stairway entrance and waited. Bradley arrived precisely at 7 p.m. Natalie heard his footsteps echoing in the main sanctuary as he called her name. Up here, Bradley, she called down. I thought we could have some privacy. She heard his hesitant footsteps on the stone stairs. When he reached the top, Bradley looked nervous and angry. This is dramatic, even for you, he said. Let's just get this over with. Of course, Natalie said. But first, I want you to see something. The view from here is spectacular. She gestured toward the railing, moving to stand beside it. Come look, it's really breathtaking. Bradley remained near the stairway. I'm not here for sightseeing, Natalie. I want to know what you're going to do about the other men you've been blackmailing. Oh, Bradley. Natalie's voice took on a sad, sympathetic tone. I know this has been difficult for you. All that guilt, all that shame, the stress of keeping secrets from Emma. Stop it, Bradley said. I'm not falling for your manipulation anymore. I'm not trying to manipulate you, Natalie said softly. I'm trying to help you understand that sometimes terrible guilt can drive people to desperate actions. Sometimes people can't live with what they've done. Bradley's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Well, imagine if someone was so consumed with guilt about cheating on their fiancé that they couldn't bear to face their wedding day. Imagine if that guilt became so overwhelming that they decided to end their suffering permanently. Bradley took a step backward toward the stairs. You're insane. Imagine if that person climbed to the top of their wedding venue and threw themselves off, Natalie continued, moving closer. How tragic that would be. How everyone would understand that the guilt had simply become too much to bear. Bradley turned to run, but Natalie was faster. She grabbed his arm and used his momentum to swing him toward the loose railing. Bradley stumbled, reached out to steady himself, and grasped the metal barrier just as Natalie applied pressure from behind. The railing gave way with a grinding shriek of metal on stone. Bradley's eyes went wide with terror as he realized what was happening. But it was too late. He plummeted 3 stories to the stone courtyard below. Natalie looked down at his motionless body and felt nothing but relief. She calmly walked back down the stairs, letting herself out through the side entrance she'd used to enter. She was back in her car within minutes. The next morning, local news reported the tragic suicide of Bradley Chen, a young software engineer who had apparently jumped from St. Mary's Cathedral bell tower the night before his wedding rehearsal. Police found a suicide note in his apartment, a note Natalie had typed on his computer after retrieving his keys from his broken body. The note confessed to infidelity and expressed overwhelming guilt about betraying his fiancée. It mentioned the stress of wedding planning, the pressure of family expectations, and the unbearable shame of his actions. Emma Winters was devastated. The wedding was canceled, the venue deposits lost, the catering contracts voided. Natalie sent her a sympathy card and a partial refund of her planning fees, along with a note expressing her shock and sorrow at the tragic turn of events. With Bradley gone, Natalie felt secure again, but she knew she needed to address the other potential witnesses before they could cause problems. Marcus Rodriguez was next. Marcus had paid his blackmail demands for 2 years without complaint, but Bradley's investigation had emboldened him. He'd stopped making payments and started asking questions about Natalie's other clients. Marcus was a real estate developer, recently married to his second wife, a woman 20 years younger with expensive tastes. He had more to lose than Bradley: a multi-million-dollar business, custody of children from his first marriage, a reputation in the community. But he also had a weakness Natalie could exploit: his weekly routine of inspecting construction sites alone, usually early in the morning before crews arrived. Natalie had planned the seduction of Marcus around the construction of his latest project, a luxury condominium complex called Riverside Heights. She'd met him there multiple times for what she'd called venue scouting for a client who wanted an urban industrial wedding theme. She knew the building's layout intimately, including the elevator shaft that was still under construction. The safety barriers were minimal, and the drop was 6 stories to a concrete foundation. Natalie sent Marcus a text. "We need to talk about Bradley. Meet me at Riverside Heights tomorrow at 6 a.m. Come alone, and we can resolve this quietly." Marcus responded, "Fine, but I'm not afraid of you anymore, Natalie. This ends now." Again, Natalie thought. He was right. It would end now. The next morning, Natalie arrived at the construction site before dawn. She knew the security guard's schedule and had timed her arrival during his coffee break. She made her way to the 6th floor, where the elevator shaft opened onto the unfinished hallway. The shaft was protected only by orange safety netting and a few warning signs. Natalie cut through the netting and positioned herself near the opening, hidden behind stacks of construction materials. When Marcus arrived, he was visibly agitated. "Where are you, Natalie?" "Up here," she called. "6th floor. We need privacy for this conversation." Marcus took the construction elevator up, his heavy footsteps echoing in the unfinished building. When he reached the 6th floor, Natalie was waiting in the shadows. "This is about Bradley, isn't it?" Marcus said without preamble. "His suicide was awfully convenient for you." "Bradley was consumed with guilt," Natalie said. "Sometimes guilt can drive people to desperate actions." "Cut the bullshit," Marcus snapped. "I know you killed him, and I know you're planning to kill me too." Natalie was impressed by his directness, but also alarmed. "Marcus, you sound paranoid. The stress of this situation—" "I left a letter with my attorney," Marcus interrupted. "If anything happens to me, it goes straight to the police. Everything about you, about what you've been doing to all of us." Natalie felt her carefully constructed world threatening to collapse again. "You're bluffing. Try me." They stared at each other in the dim morning light filtering through the unfinished windows. Natalie realized that Marcus was serious, and that killing him would only accelerate the investigation into her activities. But she also realized that Marcus had made a critical error. He'd come here alone despite claiming to have insurance against his death. "You're right," Natalie said finally. "I did kill Bradley, and I'm gonna kill you too." Marcus turned to run, but Natalie was already moving. She'd positioned herself between him and the elevator, forcing him to retreat deeper into the unfinished hallway. "The difference between you and Bradley," Natalie said, advancing slowly, "is that Bradley's death could look like suicide. Yours is going to look like an industrial accident." Marcus backed toward the open elevator shaft, unaware of the danger behind him. "You won't get away with this. People will figure it out." Will they? A real estate developer falls down an elevator shaft at his own construction site. These accidents happen all the time. OSHA will blame inadequate safety measures. Your insurance company will pay out to your widow. Marcus suddenly realized where he was and tried to step sideways, but Natalie lunged forward and shoved him hard. He windmilled his arms, trying to regain balance, but momentum carried him backward into the shaft. His scream echoed for 6 floors before ending abruptly. Natalie replaced the safety netting and left the building the same way she'd entered. 2 hours later, she was in her office, responding to emails from potential clients and reviewing vendor contracts for upcoming weddings. Marcus Rodriguez's death made page 3 of the local newspaper. Local developer dies in construction accident. OSHA launched an investigation into safety violations at the site, but no criminal charges were filed. With Bradley and Marcus eliminated, Natalie felt confident that her secrets were safe. The other men she'd blackmailed had been paying quietly for years without complaint. Most of them were too scared or too invested in their current lives to risk exposure. But Natalie had underestimated the ripple effects of her actions. Emma Winters, Bradley's former fiancée, had been devastated by his supposed suicide. She'd spent months in therapy, trying to understand how she'd missed the signs of his distress. During one session, her therapist suggested that Bradley's guilt might have been related to more than just cold feet about marriage. Emma began investigating Bradley's final weeks, trying to understand what had driven him to suicide. She discovered his communications with the private investigator, his research into Natalie's background, his contact with other men who'd worked with the same wedding planner. When Marcus Rodriguez died just weeks after Bradley, Emma's suspicions crystallized into certainty. She went to the police with a theory that sounded insane. A wedding planner was seducing and blackmailing grooms, then murdering them when they threatened to expose her. Detective Lisa Chen, no relation to Bradley, was initially skeptical, but Emma's evidence was compelling. Phone records showed extensive communication between Natalie and both dead men. Financial records revealed suspicious cash deposits into Natalie's accounts. Most damning of all, Emma had found a pattern. Over the past 4 years, 6 men who'd worked with Elegant Beginnings wedding planning had either died in apparent accidents or suicides, or had made large, unexplained cash withdrawals shortly before their weddings. Detective Chen opened an investigation into Natalie Sinclair. The investigation revealed a sophisticated blackmail operation targeting vulnerable grooms. Natalie had been careful to space out her activities, working with different venues, different vendors, different social circles. But the digital evidence was overwhelming. Compromising photos, threatening messages, payment demands. More disturbing were the deaths. Bradley Chen's suicide note contained details about his relationship with Natalie that only she could have known. Marcus Rodriguez's accident occurred at a location where Natalie had been seen multiple times. Similar patterns emerged with other victims. Detective Chen assembled a task force to investigate what the media dubbed the Black Widow wedding planner. Natalie knew the investigation was closing in when potential clients started canceling meetings and vendor relationships suddenly dried up. Her business was collapsing, her reputation destroyed by whispered rumors and social media speculation. She considered running, but where could she go? Her entire identity was built around her wedding planning business, her social connections, her carefully constructed life in the city. Instead, Natalie decided to eliminate the source of her problems, Emma Winters. Emma was living alone in the apartment she'd once shared with Bradley, working as a nurse at Children's Hospital. She'd become obsessed with exposing Natalie, spending her free time researching the case and providing information to police. Natalie began stalking Emma, learning her routines, her vulnerabilities, her schedule. Emma worked night shifts 3 times a week, leaving the hospital at 7 a.m. and driving home through downtown traffic. Natalie's plan was simple: cause a car accident that would look like driver fatigue after a long shift. She knew Emma's route, knew the intersection where she typically stopped for coffee, knew the timing of traffic lights. All she needed was the right moment. On a foggy Tuesday morning, Natalie followed Emma's car from the hospital parking garage. Emma was driving slowly, clearly exhausted after a 12-hour shift dealing with sick children. She stopped at the usual coffee shop, then continued toward her apartment building. At the intersection of 5th and Hahn, Emma's car stopped at a red light. Natalie pulled up behind her in a rental car, positioning herself for maximum impact. When the light turned green and Emma began to accelerate, Natalie floored her accelerator and rammed into the rear of Emma's sedan. The impact sent Emma's car spinning into oncoming traffic, where it was struck by a delivery truck. Natalie staged her own accident scene, positioning her rental car to suggest that she'd been unable to stop in time due to the fog and wet roads. When paramedics arrived, she was sitting in her car, sobbing and claiming that Emma had stopped suddenly without warning. But Emma survived. She was critically injured: broken ribs, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injury. But she was alive. And as she recovered in the hospital, her memory of the accident began to return. Emma remembered seeing Natalie's face in her rearview mirror just before the impact. She remembered the deliberate acceleration, the calculated timing. She remembered that this wasn't an accident at all. When Detective Chen visited Emma in the hospital, Emma's first words were, "She tried to kill me. Natalie tried to kill me." The investigation into the car accident revealed evidence that supported Emma's account. Traffic cameras showed Natalie following Emma from the hospital. Cell phone records placed Natalie in the area at the time of the accident. Most damning of all, analysis of the impact patterns suggested that Natalie had accelerated deliberately before striking Emma's car. Natalie was arrested at her office while meeting with a new client, a young couple planning their dream wedding. During her interrogation, Natalie maintained her innocence, claiming that the accident was exactly that: an accident caused by poor visibility and road conditions. She expressed shock and concern about Emma's injuries, portraying herself as another victim of a tragic situation. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Phone records, financial transactions, witness statements, forensic analysis, everything pointed to a systematic pattern of seduction, blackmail, and murder. The trial lasted 3 months. Prosecutors painted Natalie as a predator who had weaponized weddings, turning one of society's most cherished celebrations into hunting grounds for vulnerable victims. They detailed her elaborate schemes, her calculated manipulations, her escalating violence when her system was threatened. Natalie's defense attorney argued that she was a successful businesswoman who had been falsely accused by grieving families looking for someone to blame for tragic accidents. He portrayed her as a victim of circumstance, prosecuted for the crime of being present when bad things happened to her clients. But the jury wasn't convinced. The pattern was too clear, the evidence too comprehensive, the victims too numerous. Natalie was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 17 counts of extortion. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In her cell, Natalie sometimes thought about weddings. Real weddings, beautiful weddings, the kind of celebrations that had originally inspired her to become a wedding planner. She remembered the joy she'd felt creating perfect days for couples in love, the satisfaction of executing flawless events, the gratitude of brides and grooms whose dreams she'd made reality. That joy felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of manipulation and greed that had twisted her passion into a weapon. She'd started planning weddings because she believed in love and wanted to help couples celebrate their commitment. She'd ended up destroying lives because she'd found a way to profit from their vulnerability. Natalie's business, Elegant Beginnings Wedding Planning, was permanently closed. Her client testimonials were replaced with news articles about her crimes. The venues where she'd once created magical moments became crime scenes in court documents. Most of her victims' families abandoned wedding planning altogether, too traumatized by their experiences to trust the industry again. Late at night in her cell, Natalie sometimes wondered about the couples whose weddings she'd ruined. Did they still get married? Did they find other planners? Had she stolen their joy in what should have been the happiest day of their lives, the way her own joy had been corrupted by greed? She thought about Emma Winters, permanently disabled by the car accident, but still alive to see justice served. Emma, whose only crime had been loving a man who trusted the wrong wedding planner. Natalie had wanted to create perfect weddings, but she'd ended up destroying the very institution she claimed to celebrate. She'd turned marriage proposals into blackmail opportunities, wedding venues into murder scenes, and the promise of happily ever after into a threat. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to profit from other people's love stories, Natalie had written her own tragic ending, alone in a cell, surrounded by the wreckage of all the relationships she'd destroyed in pursuit of money and control. Now all she had were institutional meals, served on plastic trays, eaten alone in a cell, where she would spend the rest of her life thinking about the weddings that would never happen because of her actions. Story 4. The Sleep Technician. Diana Walsh adjusted the sleep monitoring electrodes on Mrs. Henderson's forehead and smiled reassuringly. "Just relax, Mrs. Henderson. I'll be monitoring you from the next room all night. If you need anything, just press the call button." Mrs. Henderson, a 52-year-old insurance executive, nodded nervously. "I've never done this before. My husband says I snore terribly and stop breathing sometimes." "Sleep apnea is very common," Diana said, dimming the lights. "We'll have you sorted out in no time. Sweet dreams." Diana closed the door to room 3 and walked to the monitoring station. Valley Sleep Center had 8 private rooms, each equipped with cameras, microphones, and sensors that tracked every aspect of a patient's sleep cycle. Diana had worked here for 6 years, earning a reputation as one of the most thorough and caring technicians in the facility. What her colleagues didn't know was that Diana had been using her access to unconscious patients for purposes that had nothing to do with sleep medicine. She pulled up Mrs. Henderson's intake forms on her computer. Margaret Henderson, married 28 years, 2 adult children, household income over $200,000. Address, 1247 Maple Lane in the wealthy Brookside neighborhood. Credit score, 782. Emergency contact. Husband Robert, cell phone number included. Diana opened her personal laptop and began her real work. First, she accessed Mrs. Henderson's purse, which patients were required to leave in the monitoring room for safety reasons. Diana had installed a small camera in the room's smoke detector years ago, giving her a perfect view of patients' belongings without appearing on the official monitoring equipment. Mrs. Henderson's wallet contained the usual items: driver's license, credit cards, insurance cards, family photos. Diana photographed everything with a high-resolution camera, capturing account numbers, security codes written on the backs of cards, and personal details from the photos. Next, Diana turned to Mrs. Henderson's phone. Most patients left their phones charging on the bedside table, and Diana had learned to crack simple passcodes by watching people enter them during the intake process. Mrs. Henderson had used her birth year, pathetically predictable. Diana scrolled through text messages, emails, photo galleries, and banking apps. Mrs. Henderson's digital life painted a detailed picture: marital problems, arguments with Robert about money, health concerns, text to her sister about suspicious lumps, work stress, complaints about her demanding boss, and financial information, bank account balances, investment portfolios, upcoming vacation plans. All of this information would be valuable for identity theft, but Diana had learned that the real money was in blackmail and targeted manipulation. She opened the camera app and positioned Mrs. Henderson's phone for some strategic photography. The sleep study required patients to wear minimal clothing for proper sensor placement, and Diana had become expert at staging compromising photos that suggested infidelity or inappropriate behavior without actually showing anything illegal. A few carefully angled shots of Mrs. Henderson in her underwear, combined with some creative editing and fake metadata, could suggest she'd been at a hotel with someone other than her husband. Diana had perfected the art of creating evidence of affairs that never happened. But tonight's work was interrupted by an unusual problem. Diana's computer chimed with an alert from room 5. David Reeves, a 45-year-old accountant, was showing irregular sleep patterns. His brainwaves suggested he was awake, but his breathing indicated deep sleep. Diana frowned and pulled up his video feed. David was lying still with his eyes closed, but something about his posture seemed wrong. Diana enhanced the video quality and realized with a chill that David was definitely awake, and he was watching her through the reflection in the room's window. Diana's blood ran cold. The monitoring rooms had one-way windows that allowed technicians to observe patients without being seen, but David had positioned himself to see the reflection of the monitoring station in the glass. He'd been watching Diana rifle through Mrs. Henderson's belongings. Diana quickly closed her personal laptop and focused on the official monitoring equipment, pretending to conduct routine checks. But she knew David had seen enough to understand what was happening. She needed to assess the situation carefully. David was scheduled for a full 8-hour study, which meant she had several more hours to figure out how to handle this problem. If he reported what he'd seen, Diana's entire operation would be exposed. Diana had been running her scheme for 3 years, building a database of personal information from over 400 sleep study patients. She'd made nearly $150,000 from identity theft, blackmail, and selling personal data to marketing companies and private investigators. But more than the money, Diana enjoyed the power. She'd been invisible her entire life, overlooked in school, passed over for promotions, ignored by men, dismissed by her own family. The sleep lab gave her access to people's most vulnerable moments and their most private information. For a few hours each night, she had complete control over successful, wealthy, confident people who would never give her a second glance in normal circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd found her calling in a job where people were literally unconscious of her presence. Diana had started small, just taking cash from wallets and purses. $20 here, $50 there, amounts small enough that patients would assume they'd miscounted or spent the money elsewhere. But as her confidence grew, so did her ambitions. She'd learned to clone credit cards, steal social security numbers, and access bank accounts. She'd photograph driver's licenses and insurance cards, giving her everything needed for identity theft. She'd even started planting small tracking devices in patients' cars, allowing her to monitor their movements and plan burglaries when she knew they'd be away from home. The blackmail had been a natural evolution. When Diana discovered that Judge Patricia Morrison was having an affair, revealed through compromising text messages and photos on her phone, she'd seen an opportunity for real money. She'd demanded $10,000 in exchange for her silence, and the judge had paid without question. That success had led to bigger scores. CEO Michael Chang paid $25,000 to keep photos of his drug use out of the media. City Councilwoman Sarah Kim paid $15,000 to suppress evidence of her gambling addiction. State Senator Robert Davis paid $30,000 to hide his visits to prostitutes, documented through his phone's location history and payment apps. Diana had become drunk on the power of knowing everyone's secrets while remaining completely invisible herself. But now David Reeves threatened to destroy everything. Diana walked to room 5 and quietly opened the door. David was lying still, pretending to sleep, but she could see the tension in his body. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "is everything all right? Your readings are showing some unusual patterns." David didn't respond, maintaining his charade of sleep. Diana moved closer to his bed. "I know you're awake, David. We need to talk." David's eyes opened, and he looked directly at her. "I don't know what you think I saw, but I was just trying to get comfortable." "You saw me going through Mrs. Henderson's belongings," Diana said calmly. "You've been watching me for at least an hour." David sat up slowly, the monitoring wires still attached to his scalp and chest. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just want to complete my sleep study and go home." "I'm afraid it's not that simple anymore," Diana said. She pulled up a chair and sat down beside his bed. "You see, David, what you witnessed tonight is part of a larger operation. And now you're a part of it too." "I'm not part of anything," David said firmly. "I didn't see anything illegal." Diana smiled and pulled out her phone. She showed David a photo she'd taken of his wallet contents earlier in the evening. David Reeves, 1247 Oak Street, married to Jennifer, father of 2 teenage daughters, bank account at First National, credit score 734, annual income 87,000. David's face went pale. "How did you—" "I also know about the 15,000 you embezzled from your accounting firm last year," Diana continued. "Very clever how you spread it across multiple client accounts over several months. I doubt anyone would notice unless they knew exactly what to look for. David stared at her in shock. That's impossible. You couldn't know about that. Your phone, David. Text messages with your business partner discussing creative accounting solutions. Bank transfers that don't match your client billing records. Photos of cash deposits that exceed your declared income. Diana had spent the first hour of David's sleep study conducting a thorough analysis of his digital life. She'd found evidence of tax evasion, client fraud, and marital infidelity that would destroy his career and family if exposed. What do you want? David asked quietly. I want you to forget what you saw tonight, Diana said. In exchange, I'll forget what I found on your phone. David was quiet for a long moment, processing the situation. You're blackmailing me. I'm offering you a mutually beneficial arrangement, Diana corrected. You keep my secrets, I keep yours. And if I refuse? Diana shrugged. Then I send some very interesting information to the state licensing board for accountants, the IRS, and your wife Jennifer. I'm sure she'd be fascinated to learn about your relationship with your assistant Monica. David buried his face in his hands. This is insane. You're a sleep technician. How are you doing all of this? I'm very good at my job, Diana said. Both the official one and the unofficial one. David looked up at her with a mixture of fear and resignation. Okay, I won't say anything about tonight, but I want to finish my study and leave. Of course, Dana said, standing up. But David, this conversation never happened. And if you ever decide to change your mind about our arrangement, remember that I have enough evidence to destroy your life completely. Diana returned to the monitoring station, satisfied that David would keep quiet. But as she settled back into her routine, she realized that this incident had changed everything. For the first time, someone had caught her in the act. Even though she'd successfully intimidated David into silence, she knew that her operation was now more vulnerable than ever. She needed to be more careful, more selective about her targets, more thorough in her security measures. Over the following weeks, Diana implemented new protocols. She installed better surveillance equipment to monitor patients more closely. She developed more sophisticated methods for accessing phones and digital devices. She began conducting background checks on patients before their studies, identifying potential threats and lucrative targets. But her increased caution came at a cost. The constant paranoia was exhausting, and Diana found herself making mistakes she'd never made before. 3 months after the David Reeves incident, Diana was working with a new patient, Lisa Chang, a 38-year-old pediatric nurse who'd been referred for chronic insomnia. During her intake interview, Lisa mentioned that she worked at the same hospital where Diana's blackmail victim, Dr. Patricia Morrison, served as chief of staff. Diana saw an opportunity to expand her network. If she could compromise Lisa, she might gain access to hospital records, patient information, and additional blackmail targets among the medical staff. But Lisa Chang was different from Diana's usual victims. She was observant, detail-oriented, and naturally suspicious. Qualities that made her an excellent nurse, but a dangerous target for Diana's schemes. During the sleep study, Lisa noticed several irregularities. The monitoring equipment seemed to malfunction at convenient moments. Her phone had been moved slightly from where she'd left it. Her purse had been repositioned on the chair. Most concerning of all, Lisa noticed that the smoke detector in her room had a small lens that didn't belong in a standard smoke alarm. Lisa was already awake when Diana entered her room at 3 a.m. for a routine check. Instead of pretending to sleep, Lisa sat up and confronted her directly. "That's not a standard smoke detector, is it?" Lisa said, pointing to the ceiling. Diana's heart raced, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I'm not sure what you mean. All of our safety equipment is regulation standard." "I work in a hospital," Lisa said. "I know what medical monitoring equipment looks like, and I know what hidden cameras look like. That device has a lens." Diana realized she was caught, but she also saw an opportunity. Lisa was clearly intelligent and observant, exactly the kind of person who might be useful as an accomplice, rather than a victim. "You're very perceptive," Diana said, closing the door behind her. "Most people never notice." "So you admit it's a camera?" "I admit that I'm running a more complex operation than standard sleep monitoring," Diana said. "The question is, are you going to be a problem or are you going to be an opportunity? Lisa stared at her. What kind of operation? Diana made a calculated decision to reveal part of her scheme. I collect information from patients, personal information that can be quite valuable. You're stealing from people while they sleep. I'm gathering intelligence, Diana corrected, and I'm very good at it. Good enough to have made over $200,000 in the past 3 years. Lisa was quiet for a moment, processing this information. You're blackmailing people. Sometimes, when the situation calls for it, that's illegal and deeply unethical. So is embezzling money from patients' medical funds, Diana said, which is what you've been doing at the hospital. Lisa's face went white. How could you possibly know that? Diana smiled. Your phone, Lisa. Bank records, text messages, photos of cash deposits that don't match your nursing salary. You've been skimming money from the Children's Charity Fund for months. Diana was bluffing. She hadn't had time to thoroughly investigate Lisa's phone yet, but her accusation was based on statistical probability. In her experience, most people had something to hide, and medical professionals often had access to funds they could manipulate. But Lisa's reaction told Diana that her guess was correct. I was going to pay it back, Lisa said quietly. My daughter needs surgery, and our insurance won't cover it. I was desperate. Of course you were, Diana said sympathetically. And now you have an option. Work with me, and I'll help you cover your tracks. Refuse, and I'll expose everything. Lisa buried her face in her hands. What kind of work? You have access to hospital records, patient information, staff schedules. You could identify potential targets, provide inside information, help me expand my operation. You want me to help you blackmail doctors and nurses? I want you to help me build a more sophisticated network, Diana said. Think about it, Lisa. How many wealthy patients come through your hospital? How many doctors and administrators have secrets they'd pay to protect? Lisa looked up at Diana with a mixture of fear and fascination. This is insane. This is profitable, Diana corrected, and it's much safer than trying to steal from charity funds. Over the following hour, Diana outlined her operation in detail. She showed Lisa her database of victims, her collection methods, her financial records. She explained how she'd built her network of blackmail targets and how Lisa could help expand it. By dawn, Lisa had agreed to become Diana's partner. The partnership transformed Diana's operation from a one-woman scheme into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Lisa provided access to hospital records, patient information, and staff schedules. She identified wealthy patients, influential doctors, and administrators with secrets worth protecting. Diana taught Lisa her techniques for gathering information, staging compromising photos, and building blackmail cases. Together, they developed more advanced methods for accessing digital devices, cloning identification documents, and laundering money. Within 6 months, their network had grown to include over 200 victims paying regular extortion fees. They'd expanded beyond the sleep clinic to target patients at the hospital, private medical practices, and even some of Lisa's nursing colleagues. But success bred carelessness, and carelessness led to exposure. Dr. James Morrison, husband of Judge Patricia Morrison, had been struggling with his wife's changed behavior since she'd started making mysterious cash withdrawals and seemed constantly stressed about undefined legal issues. When Patricia finally confessed that she was being blackmailed by someone who'd obtained compromising information during a medical procedure, Dr. Morrison decided to investigate. He contacted several of his medical colleagues, asking if they'd noticed any unusual behavior or financial stress among their staff or patients. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Dozens of healthcare professionals and patients had been experiencing mysterious financial pressures, behavioral changes, or unexplained anxiety related to personal issues. Dr. Morrison took his findings to the FBI, who launched an investigation into what appeared to be a large-scale medical blackmail operation. The investigation quickly focused on Valley Sleep Center, where an unusual number of patients had reported identity theft, financial fraud, or blackmail attempts shortly after undergoing sleep studies. FBI agents obtained warrants to search the facility and Diana's personal residence. What they found was a sophisticated criminal operation that had compromised hundreds of victims over 4 years. Diana's computers contained detailed profiles of victims, including personal information, compromising photos, financial records, and blackmail payment schedules. Her equipment included hidden cameras, phone cloning devices, identity theft tools, and money laundering software. Most damning of all was her partnership with Lisa Chang, which had created a paper trail of hospital records, patient information, and coordinated blackmail schemes that affected multiple medical facilities across the city. Diana and Lisa were arrested simultaneously during their respective night shifts. Diana was taken into custody at the sleep center while monitoring 3 patients, all of whom were potential victims of her schemes. Lisa was arrested at the hospital while accessing patient records for Diana's operation. The investigation revealed the scope of their crimes. Over 400 victims, more than $500,000 in blackmail payments, hundreds of cases of identity theft, and systematic violation of medical privacy laws. During interrogation, Diana showed no remorse for her actions. She viewed her victims as willing participants who had voluntarily exposed their secrets and weaknesses. She saw herself as an entrepreneur who had identified a lucrative market opportunity in other people's vulnerabilities. "These people came to me," she told FBI agents. "They put themselves in vulnerable positions, shared their personal information, trusted strangers with their most private moments. I just took advantage of opportunities they created." Lisa, by contrast, was consumed with guilt about her role in the operation. She'd started as a victim herself, coerced into cooperation through Diana's blackmail, but had eventually become an enthusiastic partner in the scheme. "She made it seem so rational," Lisa told investigators, "like we were just collecting information that was already available, like we were providing a service by helping people understand their own vulnerabilities." The trial lasted 8 months and dominated local media coverage. The prosecution presented evidence of systematic privacy violations, identity theft, extortion, and conspiracy charges that affected hundreds of victims across multiple years. Diana's defense attorney argued that she was a dedicated healthcare professional who had been unfairly targeted for collecting information that patients had voluntarily provided during legitimate medical procedures. He claimed that her actions were motivated by scientific curiosity rather than criminal intent. But the evidence was overwhelming. Victim after victim testified about the devastating impact of Diana's crimes on their personal and professional lives. Marriages had been destroyed, careers ruined, and financial security eliminated by her systematic exploitation of their trust. Judge Patricia Morrison, one of Diana's earliest blackmail victims, presided over the sentencing hearing. She described the psychological trauma of living under constant threat of exposure, the financial burden of extortion payments, and the violation of trust that had made her question every medical professional she encountered. "The defendant weaponized healthcare," Judge Morrison said. "She turned places of healing into hunting grounds, transformed medical procedures into criminal opportunities, and corrupted the fundamental trust between patients and caregivers." Diana was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, extortion, identity theft, and violation of medical privacy laws. Lisa received 15 years for her role as an accomplice. Valley Sleep Center was permanently closed, and new federal regulations were implemented to prevent similar crimes in medical facilities. Patients' rights organizations pushed for stricter oversight of medical monitoring equipment and enhanced security protocols for personal belongings during medical procedures. In her prison cell, Diana sometimes thought about sleep, real sleep, natural sleep, the kind of peaceful rest that she'd spent years studying and monitoring in others. She remembered the satisfaction she'd felt early in her career when she'd successfully diagnosed sleep disorders and helped patients improve their quality of life. That satisfaction felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of exploitation and greed that had twisted her medical knowledge into criminal tools. She'd started as a sleep technician because she wanted to help people rest better. She'd ended up destroying hundreds of lives because she'd found a way to profit from their vulnerability. Diana's victims struggled to rebuild their lives after her crimes were exposed. Many had difficulty trusting medical professionals, avoiding necessary health care, out of fear that their personal information would be compromised again. The sleep medicine field as a whole suffered reputational damage from Diana's crimes, with patients becoming more suspicious of monitoring procedures and personal information requirements during medical studies. Late at night in her cell, Diana sometimes wondered about the patients whose sleep she'd studied. Did they still suffer from sleep disorders? Had they found other doctors to help them? Had she stolen their ability to trust medical professionals the way her own medical knowledge had been corrupted by criminal ambition? She thought about Lisa Chang serving her own sentence in a different facility. Lisa, whose desperation to help her sick daughter had made her vulnerable to Diana's manipulation and eventually complicit in hundreds of crimes. Diana had wanted to be invisible, to have power over people who would never notice her in normal circumstances. But her quest for hidden influence had ultimately made her the most visible criminal in the city's recent history. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to exploit other people's sleep, Diana had permanently awakened to the reality of her own criminal nature. Alone in a cell where she would spend the next 25 years thinking about the dreams she'd stolen from hundreds of innocent people. Story 5. The Private Duty Nurse. Rebecca Martinez checked her watch as she pulled into the circular driveway of the Ashford estate. 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes early for her overnight shift. Through the massive windows, she could see Mrs. Eleanor Ashford in her wheelchair, positioned by the fireplace where she spent most of her days since the stroke that had left her paralyzed and largely nonverbal. Rebecca had been caring for Mrs. Ashford for 8 months now, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. At $4,000 per week, it was the highest-paying private duty position she'd ever held. The Ashford family was old money, railroad fortune dating back to the 1800s, and they spared no expense on Eleanor's care. What they didn't know was that Rebecca was systematically planning Eleanor's death. Rebecca gathered her nursing bag from the back seat and walked to the front door where Thomas Ashford was waiting. Eleanor's eldest son was in his 60s, a retired investment banker who managed the family's considerable financial interests. "Good evening, Rebecca," Thomas said, opening the door. "Mother's had a difficult day. She seemed agitated during physical therapy." "I'll take good care of her," Rebecca said with practiced warmth. "You know I always do." Thomas nodded gratefully. "I don't know what we would do without you. Dr. Patterson says you're the best private nurse he's ever worked with." Rebecca smiled modestly. "I just want what's best for Mrs. Ashford." After Thomas left for his weekly dinner with his brother, Rebecca settled into her routine. She checked Eleanor's vitals, administered her evening medications, and helped her with dinner. Eleanor could only communicate through eye movements and slight hand gestures, making her completely dependent on Rebecca's interpretation of her needs. The perfect victim. Rebecca had been planning this murder for 6 months, ever since she'd begun working with her business partner, Kevin Walsh. Kevin was a life insurance agent who specialized in high net worth clients, and he'd identified a lucrative opportunity in Rebecca's line of work. Private duty nurses had intimate access to wealthy families during their most vulnerable times. Family members were often elderly themselves, stressed by caregiving responsibilities, and willing to trust medical professionals with major decisions. It was the perfect environment for insurance fraud. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Kevin would approach families of Rebecca's patients, expressing concern about the financial burden of long-term care and suggesting increased life insurance coverage as a prudent safeguard. The families, already overwhelmed by medical expenses and grateful for any guidance, readily agreed to policy increases. Then Rebecca would arrange for the patient to die from complications that appeared natural and expected given their medical condition. Eleanor Ashford had been their biggest score yet. 3 months ago, Kevin had convinced Thomas and his brother William to increase Eleanor's life insurance from $500,000 to $2.5 million. The increase was easy to justify. Eleanor's care costs were exceeding $20,000 per month, and her doctors had estimated she could live in her current condition for years. "We want to ensure the family doesn't face financial hardship if mother's condition continues for an extended period," Kevin had explained. "This additional coverage will protect the estate and ensure she receives the best possible care." The Ashford brothers had signed the paperwork without hesitation. Now, 6 weeks after the policy increase, Rebecca was ready to collect. She opened her nursing bag and removed a small vial of potassium chloride. In large doses, potassium chloride could cause cardiac arrest, and the excess potassium would be difficult to detect in post-mortem blood work, especially in an elderly patient with multiple health conditions. Eleanor's medical history made her the perfect target. She'd already suffered one massive stroke, had a history of heart problems, and was taking multiple medications that could mask the signs of potassium overdose. When she died tonight, it would appear to be a natural progression of her existing conditions. Rebecca prepared Eleanor's evening insulin injection, adding the potassium chloride to the syringe. Eleanor was diabetic, so regular injections were part of her normal routine. The injection site would show nothing unusual, and the potassium would cause what appeared to be a natural cardiac event within hours. "Time for your insulin, Mrs. Ashford," Rebecca said softly, approaching Eleanor's wheelchair. Eleanor looked up at her with alert eyes. Despite her physical limitations, her mind remained sharp, and Rebecca sometimes felt uncomfortable under her intelligent gaze. Tonight, Eleanor seemed particularly aware, watching Rebecca's movements with unusual intensity. Rebecca prepared the injection site on Eleanor's arm, swabbing it with alcohol as she'd done hundreds of times before. But as she raised the syringe, Eleanor's hand moved slightly, a gesture Rebecca had learned to interpret as no. "It's okay, Mrs. Ashford," Rebecca said gently. "Just your regular insulin. You need this to stay healthy." But Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the syringe, and her expression showed fear. Somehow she knew this injection was different. Rebecca hesitated. In her previous murders, the victims had been unconscious or too impaired to understand what was happening. Eleanor's awareness made the act feel more personal, more confrontational. But Rebecca had invested too much in this plan to back out now. She'd been living beyond her means for months, spending money she expected to earn from Kevin's commission on the insurance payout. She owed rent, car payments, and credit card bills that she couldn't pay without this score. More importantly, backing out now would mean continuing to work in a profession that paid poorly and offered no real financial security. At 43, Rebecca was tired of being invisible, tired of cleaning up after wealthy people while struggling to pay her own bills. "I'm sorry," Rebecca whispered to Eleanor and administered the injection. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock and betrayal, but her paralyzed body couldn't resist. Rebecca disposed of the syringe and settled into her chair to wait. Within 30 minutes, Eleanor's breathing became labored. Her blood pressure spiked, then began dropping rapidly. Rebecca monitored the progression carefully, documenting vital signs that would support the narrative of a natural cardiac event. At 11:47 p.m., Eleanor Ashford went into cardiac arrest. Rebecca immediately began CPR and called 911, playing the role of the dedicated nurse who'd fought desperately to save her patient. When paramedics arrived, she was performing chest compressions and appeared emotionally distraught. "I don't understand what happened," she told the EMTs through tears. "She was stable all evening, then suddenly went into distress. I did everything I could." Eleanor was pronounced dead at 12:23 a.m. The next morning, Dr. Patterson signed the death certificate listing cardiac arrest as the primary cause, with contributing factors of stroke complications and diabetes. No autopsy was requested. Eleanor was 84 years old with multiple serious health conditions. Her death, while sad, was not unexpected. Thomas and William Ashford were devastated but grateful for Rebecca's care during their mother's final months. They paid her final invoice promptly and recommended her services to other families in their social circle. Kevin filed the insurance claim within 48 hours, citing the death certificate and the comprehensive medical records he'd obtained during the policy application process. The insurance company processed the claim routinely. Eleanor's medical history supported the cause of death, and there were no red flags in her recent care. Within 6 weeks, the Ashford family received $2.5 million in life insurance proceeds. Kevin earned a commission of $125,000, of which he paid Rebecca $60,000 for her role in the scheme. It was the largest payday of Rebecca's career, but it was also the beginning of her downfall. Emboldened by their success with Eleanor Ashford, Rebecca and Kevin began actively seeking new targets. Rebecca started marketing her services more aggressively, positioning herself as a specialist in end-stage care for wealthy families. Kevin developed relationships with estate planning attorneys who could refer families in need of increased life insurance coverage. Their next target was Harrison Blake, a 78-year-old retired judge who'd been left quadriplegic after a diving accident. Harrison's son Michael had hired Rebecca to provide round-the-clock care, and Kevin had convinced the family to increase Harrison's life insurance from $1 million to $4 million. But Harrison Blake was different from Eleanor Ashford in one crucial way. His brother David was a retired insurance investigator. David Blake had spent 30 years investigating suspicious claims for a major insurance company. When Kevin approached the family about increasing Harrison's coverage, David's professional instincts were triggered by several factors: the timing of the policy increase, the substantial amount of the increase, and Kevin's aggressive sales approach. David began conducting his own quiet investigation into Kevin's background and recent sales activity. What he discovered was disturbing. Kevin had sold unusually large policy increases to families of terminally ill patients, and several of those patients had died within months of the policy changes. When Harrison died suddenly from what appeared to be complications from a urinary tract infection, administered through his catheter by Rebecca using a concentrated bacterial solution, David was already prepared to challenge the death. He demanded an autopsy and hired a private forensic pathologist to conduct an independent examination. The autopsy revealed evidence of deliberate infection, bacterial concentrations that were inconsistent with natural UTI progression, and signs of direct introduction of contaminated material through the catheter. David took his findings to the police and the insurance company simultaneously. Within days, investigators were examining the deaths of Eleanor Ashford, Harrison Blake, and 3 other patients who had been cared for by Rebecca and insured by Kevin. The investigation revealed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Unusually large life insurance policy increases followed by deaths within weeks or months, all involving patients cared for by Rebecca Martinez and insured by Kevin Walsh. When investigators examined Eleanor Ashford's body, they found evidence of potassium chloride poisoning that had been missed during the initial examination. Harrison Blake's infection showed clear signs of deliberate introduction. The other victims revealed similar evidence of accelerated deaths. Rebecca was arrested at the home of her current patient, a 92-year-old woman with dementia, whose family had just increased her life insurance to $3 million. In Rebecca's nursing bag, investigators found vials of potassium chloride, concentrated bacterial cultures, and detailed notes about the patient's medical routine and security arrangements. Kevin was arrested simultaneously at his office, where investigators found client files detailing the insurance fraud scheme, commission records showing payments tied to patient deaths, and communications with Rebecca planning the murders. During interrogation, Rebecca initially maintained that she was simply providing compassionate end-stage care and that the deaths were natural progressions of her patient's conditions. She portrayed herself as a dedicated nurse who had been unfairly targeted because she worked with terminally ill patients who naturally had high mortality rates. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Medical examiners had found clear signs of poisoning and deliberate infection in multiple victims. Financial records showed a direct correlation between her income and patient deaths. Most damning of all, investigators had recorded phone conversations between Rebecca and Kevin planning the timing and methods of future murders. Kevin, faced with the same evidence, quickly agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He detailed the entire scheme, including Rebecca's methods for killing patients and their system for identifying and targeting wealthy families. "She was the one who actually killed them," Kevin told investigators. "I just sold the insurance. I never thought she would actually murder people when we started this." But investigators discovered that Kevin had been fully aware of Rebecca's methods from the beginning. He'd helped her research patients' medical conditions to determine the best methods for causing apparently natural deaths. He'd even provided her with some of the materials she used to kill her victims. The trial lasted 4 months and generated extensive media coverage. Prosecutors described Rebecca as a predator who had weaponized healthcare, turning her medical knowledge and trusted position into tools for systematic murder. Family members of her victims testified about the devastation her crimes had caused. They described not only the loss of their loved ones, but the additional trauma of learning that their final weeks had been spent in the care of someone who was planning their deaths. Thomas Ashford testified about his mother's final evening. describing how Rebecca had seemed particularly attentive and caring during Eleanor's last hours. "She held my mother's hand when she died," he said through tears. "I thanked her for being so compassionate. I had no idea she was the one who killed her." Rebecca's defense attorney argued that she was a dedicated healthcare professional who had been corrupted by Kevin's influence and financial pressures. He claimed that her actions were motivated by desperation rather than greed, and that she had convinced herself she was ending the suffering of patients who were already dying. But the prosecution's evidence painted a different picture. Rebecca had been living an increasingly expensive lifestyle funded by her murder profits. She'd been planning to expand the operation to include nursing homes and assisted living facilities. She'd shown no remorse for her victims and had continued killing, even after investigators began examining suspicious deaths. Most damning of all were recorded conversations where Rebecca discussed her victims with cold calculation, referring to them as problems to solve and revenue opportunities. Rebecca was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kevin received 25 years for conspiracy and insurance fraud. The convictions led to major changes in the private duty nursing industry. Insurance companies implemented new protocols for reviewing large policy increases, especially for terminally ill patients. Healthcare agencies began requiring more extensive background checks and psychological evaluations for private duty nurses. Families became more cautious about trusting their most vulnerable members to individual caregivers, leading to increased demand for agency-based care with multiple staff members and oversight. In her prison cell, Rebecca sometimes thought about nursing. Real nursing, compassionate nursing, the kind of care that had originally inspired her to enter the healthcare field. She remembered the satisfaction she'd felt early in her career when she'd helped patients recover from illness or provided comfort during their final days. That satisfaction felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of financial stress and resentment that had twisted her medical knowledge into murder weapons. She'd started nursing because she wanted to help people heal. She'd ended up killing 7 vulnerable patients because she'd found a way to profit from their deaths. Rebecca's victims' families struggled to rebuild their trust in healthcare providers. Many avoided private duty nurses altogether, choosing institutional care despite the reduced personal attention and higher costs. The nursing profession as a whole suffered reputational damage from Rebecca's crimes, with families becoming more suspicious of healthcare workers who had access to vulnerable patients in private settings. Late at night in her cell, Rebecca sometimes wondered about the patients she'd killed. What would their final months have been like with proper care? How much longer could they have lived? Had she stolen precious time with their families the way her own greed had corrupted her calling to heal? She thought about Eleanor Ashford's eyes during that final injection, the intelligence and awareness that had made her realize something was wrong. Eleanor had trusted Rebecca completely, had depended on her for every aspect of daily care, and had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. Rebecca had wanted financial security and respect, but her quest for easy money had ultimately destroyed any possibility of finding satisfaction in honest work. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to profit from other people's deaths, Rebecca had killed her own future, alone in a cell where she would spend the rest of her life thinking about the healing she could have provided instead of the lives she'd stolen for money. Story 6, The Lucid Dream Killer. Dr. Miranda Hayes adjusted the EEG electrodes on her patient's scalp and dimmed the lights in her private sleep laboratory. Across from her, James Morrison lay on the comfortable reclining chair, his breathing already deepening as the guided meditation began to take effect. "Remember, James," Miranda said in her practiced, soothing voice, "tonight you're going to achieve full lucidity. You'll know you're dreaming, and you'll have complete control over your dream environment." And James nodded without opening his eyes. This was his 6th session with Dr. Hayes, and he'd been making remarkable progress in lucid dreaming. As a successful hedge fund manager, James had sought out Miranda's specialized therapy to help with his chronic insomnia and stress-related nightmares. What he didn't know was that Miranda had been conditioning him for something far more sinister than better sleep. Miranda watched James's brain waves on her monitor as he slipped into REM sleep. Alpha waves, theta waves, and finally the distinctive pattern that indicated he was dreaming. She waited another 10 minutes until his breathing stabilized in deep sleep, then began the real work. "James, you're dreaming now," she whispered into the headphones connected to his ears. "You know you're dreaming. You have complete control. In this dream, you're standing in your kitchen at home." Through the EEG, Miranda could see James's brain responding to her suggestions. His training over the past months had made him exceptionally susceptible to dream programming. She'd taught him to lucid dream, but she'd also taught him to accept her voice as his own subconscious guidance. "You see your neighbor Sarah through the kitchen window," Miranda continued. "She's in her garden again, playing her music too loud, letting her dog bark at all hours. In your dream, you can finally do something about the noise problem." James's facial muscles twitched slightly as his dream mind processed the scenario. Miranda had been carefully building this narrative over weeks, programming him to associate Sarah with increasing frustration and anger. "You walk outside to talk to her. In your dream, you have the power to make her listen. You can make her understand how much her behavior affects you." Miranda paused, watching James's brain waves spike with emotional activation. She'd been studying sleep research for 15 years, but it wasn't until 3 years ago that she discovered the true potential of lucid dream manipulation. It had started as legitimate research. Miranda was investigating whether lucid dreaming could be used therapeutically to help patients overcome phobias and trauma. She'd published papers on dream control techniques and built a successful private practice, helping wealthy clients overcome sleep disorders and nightmares. But Miranda's breakthrough had come by accident when she'd been working with a patient named Robert Chen, a pharmaceutical executive who'd been experiencing recurring nightmares about his ex-wife. During one session, Miranda had guided Robert through a lucid dream where he confronted his ex-wife in their old house. She'd intended it as a therapeutic exercise in emotional processing. 2 days later, Robert's ex-wife was found dead in that same house, killed in a manner exactly matching the dream scenario Miranda had programmed. Initially, Miranda had been horrified, assuming it was a tragic coincidence. But as she'd reviewed her session notes and Robert's brainwave patterns, she'd realized what had happened. Robert had been so deeply conditioned to follow dream programming that he'd acted out the scenario in real life, completely believing he was still dreaming. Robert had no memory of the murder. In his mind, he'd simply had a very vivid lucid dream about confronting his ex-wife. When police questioned him, he'd even mentioned the dream to investigators, describing it as therapeutic release. The fact that he'd willingly shared the dream content had actually eliminated him as a suspect. What guilty person would voluntarily describe their murder method to police? Miranda had realized she'd stumbled onto the perfect murder weapon, the human subconscious mind. Over the following year, Miranda had refined her technique. She'd learned to identify patients who were especially susceptible to dream programming, typically high achievers with obsessive personalities who threw themselves completely into mastering lucid dreaming. She developed methods for implanting specific scenarios, emotional triggers, and behavioral commands that would activate during programmed dream states. Most importantly, she'd learned to make her subjects believe they maintained complete control over their actions. They genuinely thought they were making conscious choices within their dreams, never realizing they were following carefully implanted programming. James Morrison was her 13th subject. Miranda had been targeting James for 6 months, ever since she'd learned about his ongoing legal battle with his neighbor, Sarah Fletcher. Sarah was a widow who lived next door to James's expensive townhouse, and their property dispute had escalated into a bitter feud involving noise complaints, fence lines, and legal threats. James had sought out Miranda's services because the stress of the lawsuit was causing him severe insomnia and anxiety dreams about confronting Sarah. He'd wanted to use lucid dreaming to practice difficult conversations and reduce his anxiety about the legal proceedings. Miranda had seen an opportunity. "Sarah is being unreasonable again," Miranda continued her programming session. "In your dream, you have the power to end this conflict permanently. You walk over to her garden shed where she keeps her tools." James's breathing changed slightly, his muscles tensing even in sleep. Miranda watched his brain waves carefully, monitoring the areas associated with motor planning and emotional arousal. "You pick up the gardening shears from her tool rack. In your dream, you have complete control. You can make all the noise and conflict disappear forever." Miranda had chosen the method carefully. Sarah's garden shed was never locked, and James had mentioned during their sessions that he'd seen her working there at night when she couldn't sleep. Miranda had even walked through the neighborhood herself, confirming the layout and timing of Sarah's routines. Sarah doesn't see you approaching. In your dream, you have the element of surprise. You can finally solve this problem that's been keeping you awake at night. James's hand moved slightly, his fingers curling as if gripping something. His face showed the focused expression Miranda had learned to associate with subjects acting out their programmed scenarios. You approach Sarah from behind. In your dream, you can end this conflict with one decisive action. The gardening shears are sharp and effective. Miranda continued the programming for another hour, implanting detailed instructions for the murder scenario while reinforcing James's belief that he was in complete control of his dream experience. She programmed specific timing cues, Sarah's late-night gardening schedule, and escape routes that would minimize his chances of being caught. Most importantly, she programmed him to have no conscious memory of the actual murder when he woke up. In his mind, it would remain just another vivid, lucid dream. When James finally stirred awake at the end of the session, he seemed refreshed and positive. "That was incredible, Dr. Hayes," he said, stretching as she removed the EEG electrodes. "I had such clear control over my dream tonight. I actually confronted Sarah about the noise problem, and I felt completely confident and in charge." "That's wonderful progress," Miranda said with practiced enthusiasm. "How did the confrontation go in your dream?" "It was very satisfying," James said. "I finally stood up to her behavior. I think these sessions are really helping me process my anxiety about the situation." Miranda nodded approvingly. "I think you're ready to handle any conflict that arises with Sarah. You have the tools now to take decisive action." That night, Miranda sat in her car outside James's neighborhood, watching and waiting. At 11:47 p.m., she saw James leave his house through the back door, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who believed they were still dreaming. Miranda followed at a distance as James made his way to Sarah's garden shed, retrieved the gardening shears exactly as programmed, and approached Sarah's house where she was indeed working in her garden by lamplight. The murder unfolded exactly as Miranda had programmed it. Sarah never saw James coming. The attack was swift and decisive. James completed the scenario and returned home, where he would sleep peacefully until morning, completely unaware that he'd just committed murder. Miranda drove home, already planning her next subject. The investigation into Sarah Fletcher's murder focused immediately on the obvious suspect, James Morrison. The property dispute, the legal threats, the weapon taken from Sarah's own garden shed, everything pointed to James as the killer. But James had a perfect defense. He'd been asleep all night and had simply dreamed about confronting Sarah. He described the dream in detail to investigators, seeming genuinely confused about why they were asking him about Sarah's death. "I had this incredibly vivid lucid dream about talking to Sarah in her garden," James told Detective Lisa Park. "I've been working with Dr. Hayes on lucid dreaming therapy for my insomnia. The dreams feel very real, but obviously I know the difference between dreaming and reality." Detective Park was puzzled by James's complete openness about the dream. His description matched the murder scene in disturbing detail, but his willingness to share the information seemed to indicate innocence. What guilty person would voluntarily provide police with their exact method of murder? Moreover, James had an alibi of sorts. His home security system showed him entering his house at 9:30 p.m. and not leaving until 7 a.m. the next morning. The motion sensors inside his house confirmed he'd been in his bedroom all night. What the security system didn't show was James leaving through the back door, which had a faulty sensor that Miranda had identified during her reconnaissance of the neighborhood. James passed a polygraph test, genuinely believing he was innocent. His emotional responses were consistent with someone who'd experienced a vivid dream, not someone covering up a murder. Without physical evidence linking James to the scene, and with his apparent cooperation and consistent story, prosecutors declined to charge him with Sarah's murder. The case went cold within 3 months. Miranda watched the investigation with fascination and growing confidence. Her method was perfect. It created subjects who genuinely believed in their own innocence because they had no conscious memory of their crimes. She began identifying her next targets more aggressively. Dr. Patricia Williams was a successful plastic surgeon who'd been experiencing nightmares about malpractice lawsuits. She'd sought out Miranda's services to help manage her anxiety about a particular patient who was threatening to sue over a botched procedure. Miranda spent 8 sessions programming Patricia to believe she could correct her mistakes through dream scenarios where she eliminated the problematic patient. Patricia thought she was practicing confident responses to legal challenges, not planning a murder. The patient, Angela Martinez, was found dead in her apartment from what appeared to be a medical emergency, a reaction to medication that Patricia had convinced her to take during a follow-up appointment. Patricia had no memory of the encounter, believing she'd only dreamed about resolving the lawsuit threat. Miranda's third programmed killer was David Chen, a real estate developer who'd been having stress dreams about environmental protesters blocking his latest project. Miranda programmed him to clear the obstacles in his dreams, and David dutifully eliminated the protest leader during what he believed was a particularly satisfying lucid dream about taking control of his development timeline. Each murder was different in method and motive, preventing investigators from identifying a pattern. The subjects all had clear motives for their crimes, but equally clear defenses. They'd all been asleep at the times of the murders and had simply dreamed about their conflicts. Miranda's reputation as a sleep therapist grew as word spread about her remarkable success in helping high-stress professionals manage their anxiety through lucid dream control. She began charging premium rates and attracting even wealthier clients with more significant conflicts to resolve. But Miranda's perfect system began to unravel with her fourth subject, Michael Thompson, a pharmaceutical executive who'd been worried about a whistleblower threatening to expose safety violations in his company's drug trials. Miranda had programmed Michael to eliminate the whistleblower, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, during what he believed was a stress relief dream about neutralizing threats to his career. Michael had carried out the programming perfectly, poisoning Dr. Walsh with chemicals from his own laboratory during what he thought was an elaborate lucid dream. But Dr. Walsh had been working with FBI investigators on the pharmaceutical safety violations. When she died under suspicious circumstances, federal agents immediately began investigating everyone connected to the case. The FBI's investigation into Dr. Walsh's murder was far more thorough than the local police investigations Miranda had observed before. Federal agents examined Michael's phone records, financial transactions, and professional relationships with sophisticated analytical tools. They discovered that Michael had been seeing a sleep therapist named Dr. Miranda Hayes for anxiety management. When they interviewed Michael about his sessions with Miranda, he mentioned having vivid dreams about confronting Dr. Walsh, dreams that matched the murder scenario in disturbing detail. FBI behavioral analysts recognized the pattern: a subject with clear motive, detailed knowledge of the crime, but apparently genuine belief in his own innocence, combined with voluntary disclosure of incriminating dream content. Agent Sarah Kim had encountered similar cases during her work on cult deprogramming and mind control investigations. She recognized the signs of sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to create unconscious compliance with programmed behavior. Agent Kim obtained warrants to investigate Miranda's other recent patients and their possible connections to unsolved murders. What she found was a pattern of deaths connected to Miranda's sleep therapy clients, all involving people who'd had conflicts with victims and who'd reported vivid dreams about resolving those conflicts. The FBI began surveillance of Miranda's practice, recording her sessions and analyzing her programming techniques. What they discovered was a sophisticated system of hypnotic conditioning disguised as legitimate lucid dream therapy. Miranda was arrested while conducting a programming session with her latest subject, a city councilman who'd been having anxiety dreams about a corruption investigation. In Miranda's notes, agents found detailed plans for programming the councilman to eliminate the lead investigator during a staged lucid dream. During the raid on Miranda's laboratory, investigators found extensive records of her subject's programming, including brainwave analyses and behavioral conditioning schedules and detailed murder scenarios. She'd been documenting her techniques like a research project, apparently planning to publish her findings as a breakthrough in applied psychology. The investigation revealed 17 murders connected to Miranda's programmed subjects over 3 years. Each killer had genuinely believed they were acting within controlled dreams, following what they thought were their own subconscious desires for resolution and control. Miranda's trial became a landmark case in the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and criminal law. Prosecutors had to prove that Miranda had used sophisticated hypnotic techniques to program unwitting subjects to commit murders while believing they were dreaming. The defense argued that Miranda was conducting legitimate sleep research and that any connections between her therapy sessions and subsequent deaths were coincidental. They claimed that people naturally dreamed about their conflicts and that some unstable individuals might act on those dreams independently. But the FBI's evidence was overwhelming. Brainwave recordings showed Miranda subjects entering programmed states during which they received specific behavioral instructions. Session transcripts revealed Miranda implanting detailed murder scenarios while subjects were in vulnerable hypnotic states. Most damning were Miranda's own research notes, which clearly demonstrated her awareness that she was programming real-world violence, not therapeutic dream scenarios. The prosecution brought in leading experts in hypnosis, sleep research, and behavioral psychology to explain how Miranda had weaponized legitimate therapeutic techniques to create unconscious killers. Dr. Robert Sterling, a forensic psychologist, testified that Miranda had developed perhaps the most sophisticated mind control system ever documented in criminal history. The defendant didn't just manipulate her subjects, Dr. Sterling explained to the jury. She created a system where they would commit murders while genuinely believing they were acting within controlled dreams. She turned their own minds into weapons against them. Miranda's programmed killers testified as prosecution witnesses, describing their sessions and the vivid dreams that had preceded their crimes. Several broke down emotionally as they realized they'd been manipulated into committing murders they would never have considered in their conscious minds. James Morrison sobbed as he testified about killing Sarah Fletcher. "I thought I was learning to control my dreams," he said. "I never would have hurt anyone. She made me into a killer without me even knowing it." Miranda showed no remorse during the trial. She viewed her subjects as weak-willed individuals who'd volunteered to be programmed through their own desire for dream control. In her mind, she'd simply given them the tools to act on their existing conflicts and desires. "I didn't force anyone to do anything," Miranda told the court during her testimony. "I taught them to access their subconscious minds and take control of their dream experiences. What they chose to do with that control was their decision." Miranda was convicted on 17 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her conviction established new legal precedents for prosecuting mind control-based crimes and led to increased regulation of experimental psychological therapies. Her programmed killers received varying sentences based on their level of awareness and cooperation with investigators. Several were sentenced to psychiatric treatment facilities rather than traditional prisons, as courts struggled to determine appropriate punishment for individuals who'd committed murders while genuinely believing they were dreaming. The case led to major reforms in sleep research ethics and psychological therapy oversight. Professional organizations implemented new safeguards to prevent the misuse of hypnotic and suggestive techniques in clinical settings. In her prison cell, Miranda sometimes thought about dreams, real dreams, natural dreams, the kind of unconscious processing that had originally fascinated her about sleep research. She remembered the excitement she'd felt early in her career when she discovered how lucid dreaming could help patients overcome trauma and anxiety. That excitement felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of manipulation and control that had twisted her knowledge of the human mind into weapons against the very people who trusted her to heal them. She'd started studying sleep because she wanted to help people find peace and rest. She'd ended up destroying 17 lives because she'd found a way to turn dreams into instruments of murder. Miranda's victims' families struggled to understand how their loved ones could have been killed by people who genuinely believed they were innocent. The concept of unconscious murder challenged their basic understanding of justice, responsibility, and human nature. Her programmed killers faced their own psychological devastation, struggling to reconcile their actions with their memories and self-concepts. Many required extensive therapy to process the realization that they'd been manipulated into committing murders they would never have consciously chosen. Late at night in her cell, Miranda sometimes wondered about the dreams her former subjects were having now. Were they still experiencing lucid dreams? Had her programming permanently altered their sleep patterns? Had she stolen their ability to find peace in unconsciousness, the way her own research had been corrupted by the desire for control? She thought about James Morrison, who would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd killed his neighbor while believing he was dreaming. James, whose only crime had been seeking help for insomnia and stress. Miranda had wanted to unlock the power of the human subconscious mind, but her quest for control over others had ultimately trapped her in a waking nightmare of her own creation, alone in a cell where she would spend the rest of her life thinking about the dreams she'd turned into instruments of death. Story 7. The Cult of Productivity. Samantha Cruz stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan penthouse office, watching the morning rush of worker ants far below. At 45, she commanded a business empire worth $800 million, all built on a simple premise: helping successful people become even more successful. Her company, Optimal Living Strategies, had transformed from a boutique life coaching practice into a global phenomenon. Fortune 500 CEOs, tech billionaires, hedge fund managers, and A-list celebrities all sought out Samantha's exclusive peak performance protocol, a comprehensive system for maximizing human potential through radical optimization of time, energy, and decision-making. What her clients didn't realize was that Samantha wasn't just optimizing their productivity. She was systematically dismantling their independent judgment and rebuilding them as extensions of her own will. The intercom on her desk chimed softly. "Ms. Cruz, Jonathan Weber is here for his 9 a.m. intensive." "Send him in, Monica." Jonathan Weber entered the office with the determined stride of a man accustomed to controlling multi-billion-dollar mergers. As the CEO of Weber Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate, Jonathan was worth approximately $2.3 billion. He was also, Samantha noted with satisfaction, showing all the signs of advanced conditioning from their 18 months of work together. "Jonathan, you look energized," Samantha said, gesturing to the sleek white chairs arranged around her glass conference table. "How are you feeling about implementing Phase 7 of your optimization protocol?" Jonathan's eyes lit up with the fervor Samantha had learned to cultivate in her highest value clients. "I've been thinking about it constantly, Samantha. The family relationships audit you recommended. I think you're absolutely right that my emotional energy is being drained by people who don't align with my growth trajectory." Samantha smiled. Phase 7 was the critical breakthrough point where clients began voluntarily isolating themselves from their existing support networks. It was disguised as a rational business decision, eliminating energy vampires and productivity saboteurs from their lives. But the result was total social isolation that made them completely dependent on Samantha's guidance. "Tell me about your progress with the family audit," Samantha said, opening her leather portfolio. "Well, I've implemented the communication boundaries you suggested with my brother Michael. I've stopped taking his calls about the family foundation. He's clearly threatened by my personal growth and trying to drag me back into old patterns of obligation and guilt." Samantha nodded approvingly. Michael Weber was Jonathan's business partner and the co-founder of their family's charitable foundation. He was also the last person in Jonathan's life who might question Samantha's increasing influence over his brother's decisions. "And your wife, Catherine?" Jonathan's expression grew more troubled, but he spoke with the mechanical precision Samantha had trained into him. "Catherine is struggling to adapt to my new optimization protocols. She's resistant to the efficiency metrics I've introduced for our household management. I think she may need to be categorized as a limiting factor in my growth trajectory." "That's a difficult but important realization, Jonathan. What does your data tell you about the relationship's impact on your peak performance metrics?" Jonathan pulled out his phone and opened the productivity tracking app that Samantha had convinced all her clients to use religiously. "My sleep quality drops by 12% on nights when Catherine initiates unscheduled emotional conversations. My cognitive performance scores are consistently lower after family dinners that exceed the optimal 90-minute time frame." Samantha had programmed this app herself, using fabricated algorithms to produce whatever data would support her manipulation goals. The numbers Jonathan was reading had nothing to do with actual productivity metrics and everything to do with isolating him from his wife. "The data is very clear," Samantha said gravely. "Catherine's emotional needs are incompatible with your commitment to optimal living. You have a choice to make, Jonathan. You can continue compromising your potential to accommodate her limitations, or you can prioritize your growth trajectory and implement a more radical optimization solution. What kind of solution? Samantha leaned forward, her voice taking on the intimate tone she used for her most sensitive programming. Some of my most successful clients have found that their peak performance requires complete environmental control. They've restructured their living situations to eliminate all sources of inefficiency and emotional drain. You mean separation? I mean liberation, Samantha corrected. Liberation from relationships that no longer serve your highest potential. Think about it, Jonathan. What would your life look like if every person in your environment where it was completely aligned with your optimization goals? Jonathan was quiet for several minutes, processing this suggestion with the methodical analysis Samantha had trained him to apply to all decisions. She watched him mentally calculating the pros and cons, unaware that his entire framework for evaluation had been programmed by her over months of intensive conditioning. I think you're right, Jonathan said finally. Catherine represents a significant drag on my optimization metrics. If I'm truly committed to peak performance, I need to eliminate sources of inefficiency from my environment. That's a breakthrough realization, Jonathan. But separation is just the first step. True optimization requires building a completely supportive environment filled with people who share your commitment to excellence. This was the transition point where Samantha moved her clients from isolation into dependence. Once they'd eliminated their existing relationships, she filled the void with people under her control. Other clients, her staff members, and carefully selected individuals who would reinforce her programming. I want you to consider joining the Inner Circle, Samantha continued. It's an exclusive community of my most advanced clients who've committed to living together as they pursue absolute optimization. Think of it as a laboratory for peak human performance. Jonathan's eyes widened with interest. Other CEOs are doing this? Richard Morrison from Morrison Tech, Sarah Chen from Chen Capital, David Park from Park Pharmaceuticals. They've all made the transition to optimize living environments. They're achieving performance levels that seemed impossible when they were constrained by traditional relationship structures. What Samantha didn't mention was that Richard, Sarah, and David had all signed over controlling interests in their companies to her management firm as part of their optimization process. They now lived in a compound in upstate New York, spending their days in intensive personal development sessions, while Samantha's business managers ran their former empires. The Inner Circle was Samantha's masterpiece, a commune of billionaires who believed they were pursuing personal excellence while she systematically stripped them of their independence, their assets, and their connection to the outside world. How does the Inner Circle work exactly? Jonathan asked. It's a residential program where participants live together in an environment completely designed for optimal performance. Every aspect of daily life is structured to eliminate inefficiency and maximize growth. Nutrition, exercise, sleep, work schedules, social interactions, everything is optimized based on the latest research in human performance science. Samantha pulled up a tablet showing photos of the compound, a sprawling modern complex in the Hudson Valley with private offices, state-of-the-art fitness facilities, organic gardens, and meditation spaces. It looked like a luxury resort designed for the world's most successful people. Participants transfer their business management responsibilities to our optimization team so they can focus entirely on personal development. Samantha continued. It eliminates the distraction of day-to-day operations and allows for complete immersion in peak performance protocols. How long is the program? That depends on your commitment to transformation. Some participants find that 6 months is sufficient to achieve breakthrough results. Others discover that optimal living requires a longer-term dedication to the process. What Samantha didn't say was that no one had ever completed the program and returned to their previous lives. Once clients transferred their business control and moved to the compound, they became completely dependent on her approval for everything from meals to communication with the outside world. The fee structure reflects the exclusivity and intensity of the experience, Samantha said, sliding a contract across the table. $100 million for the first year, with additional fees based on the complexity of optimizing your business operations during your absence. Jonathan barely glanced at the price. After 18 months of conditioning, he'd been programmed to view any expense as worthwhile if it promised increased optimization. Samantha had gradually escalated his spending on her services from $50,000 per month to over $1 million, always framing each increase as an investment in his peak performance. "When can I start?" Jonathan asked. "We need to complete the preparation phase first. That means implementing complete separation from limiting relationships and transferring operational control of Weber Industries to our optimization team. I estimate 6 weeks for full preparation." Over the following months, Samantha guided Jonathan through the systematic destruction of his life outside her influence. She convinced him to divorce Catherine, citing irreconcilable differences in their approaches to personal growth. She helped him structure the separation to minimize Catherine's financial settlement, arguing that protecting his assets was essential for funding his optimization journey. More crucially, she persuaded Jonathan to sign temporary management agreements, giving her firm operational control of Weber Industries. This was presented as a necessary step to free his mental energy for the intensive personal development work ahead. Jonathan's brother Michael became increasingly concerned as he watched Jonathan make these radical life changes. Michael had been suspicious of Samantha's influence for months, but his attempts to discuss his concerns with Jonathan were dismissed as limiting beliefs and resistance to growth. When Michael hired a private investigator to research Samantha's background and discovered that several other wealthy individuals had disappeared into her inner circle program, he realized his brother was involved in something far more dangerous than life coaching. Michael's investigation revealed that Samantha had been targeting ultra-wealthy individuals for over a decade, gradually building what appeared to be a sophisticated financial cult. Her previous clients had all followed similar patterns: isolation from family, transfer of business control to Samantha's management company, and eventual disappearance into residential programs that they never seemed to complete. More disturbing, Michael discovered that 3 former clients had died under suspicious circumstances after apparently trying to leave Samantha's programs. All 3 deaths were ruled accidental or natural, but the timing was suspicious enough to warrant further investigation. Michael took his findings to the FBI, but initially struggled to get law enforcement to take the case seriously. Samantha's clients appeared to be making their decisions voluntarily, and the contracts they signed were legally binding. Without evidence of explicit coercion or fraud, prosecutors were reluctant to intervene in what appeared to be expensive lifestyle choices by consenting adults. But Michael persisted and eventually connected with Agent Sarah Kim, who specialized in financial crimes involving psychological manipulation. Agent Kim had been tracking similar cases involving high net worth individuals who'd been isolated from their families and systematically defrauded by charismatic coaches and advisors. Agent Kim began investigating Samantha's operation more thoroughly, using financial analysis tools to trace the flow of money from her clients' accounts into her various business entities. What she discovered was a sophisticated wealth extraction system disguised as personal development services. Meanwhile, Jonathan completed his preparation phase and moved to the Inner Circle compound. Samantha personally drove him to the facility, maintaining the fiction that this was a temporary program designed to accelerate his personal optimization. The compound was even more impressive in person than in the photos. 23 current residents lived in individual luxury suites, following daily schedules designed to maximize their personal development. Each day included morning meditation, optimization seminars, one-on-one coaching sessions, fitness training, and group discussions about peak performance principles. What Jonathan didn't realize was that every aspect of the program was designed to deepen his psychological dependence on Samantha and eliminate his ability to think independently. The meditation sessions included subliminal programming, the seminars reinforced cult-like thinking patterns, and the coaching sessions were intensive conditioning designed to break down his remaining independent judgment. The other residents welcomed Jonathan enthusiastically, sharing stories about their own transformation through the optimization process. They spoke with the fervor of true believers, describing how Samantha had helped them transcend the limitations of their previous lives and achieve unprecedented levels of personal excellence. Richard Morrison, the former tech CEO, seemed particularly eager to share his experience. I thought I was successful before coming here, he told Jonathan during their first group discussion. But I was actually trapped by the illusion of achievement. Samantha helped me understand that real success means complete alignment with optimal living principles. Jonathan learned that Richard had been at the compound for 2 years and showed no signs of wanting to leave. When Jonathan asked about Richard's company, Richard seemed confused by the question. The business operations are handled by Samantha's optimization team, Richard said. I don't need to worry about those distractions anymore. My focus is entirely on personal development now. As weeks passed, Jonathan found himself falling into the same patterns. The intensive daily programming was breaking down his ability to think critically about his situation. He began to accept Samantha's interpretations of his thoughts and feelings as more accurate than his own perceptions. When Jonathan occasionally wondered about his life outside the compound, Samantha would guide him through optimization exercises that helped him understand why those thoughts represented resistance to growth. She convinced him that his desire to contact his ex-wife or his brother were symptoms of optimization anxiety, fear of change that was preventing him from achieving his highest potential. Meanwhile, Agent Kim's investigation was making progress. Financial analysis had revealed that Samantha's clients were systematically transferring their wealth to her various entities through a complex web of consulting fees, management contracts, and program payments. Over the past decade, she'd extracted over $2 billion from approximately 30 high-net-worth individuals. More concerning, Agent Kim had identified a pattern of escalating control that suggested Samantha's operation was evolving from financial fraud into something more dangerous. Recent clients were signing increasingly restrictive contracts that gave Samantha legal guardianship over their medical decisions, communications, and financial affairs. The FBI obtained warrants to investigate the compound, but Samantha had been careful to structure her operation within legal boundaries. The residents were all adults who had voluntarily signed extensive contracts agreeing to the program's restrictions. They had regular communication with the outside world through monitored phone calls and supervised visits. But Agent Kim recognized the signs of sophisticated psychological coercion. The residents displayed classic symptoms of cult indoctrination, altered speech patterns, inability to process information that contradicted their group beliefs, and extreme deference to Samantha's authority. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Agent Kim managed to interview Catherine Weber, Jonathan's ex-wife. Catherine had been documenting Jonathan's transformation over the 18 months he'd worked with Samantha, keeping detailed records of the changes in his personality, decision-making patterns, and relationship with his family. Catherine's documentation provided a clear timeline of psychological manipulation that Agent Kim could use to build a criminal case. More importantly, Catherine had recorded several phone conversations where Samantha had explicitly discussed strategies for isolating Jonathan from his family and gaining control over his business decisions. Armed with this evidence, Agent Kim obtained warrants for a more intensive investigation of Samantha's operation. The FBI conducted simultaneous raids on the compound, Samantha's Manhattan office, and her various business locations. At the compound, agents found extensive documentation of psychological conditioning techniques, including detailed profiles of each resident's psychological vulnerabilities and specific programming strategies designed to maintain their dependence. Samantha had been treating her clients like laboratory subjects, documenting the effectiveness of various manipulation techniques. Most disturbing were Samantha's personal notes about residents who had expressed desire to leave the program. 3 individuals had died within weeks of questioning the program's methods, and Samantha's notes suggested she had viewed their deaths as necessary optimizations of the group dynamic. The FBI's investigation revealed that Samantha had been using a combination of psychological manipulation, legal coercion, and selective elimination to maintain control over her billion-dollar human asset portfolio. The residents weren't just victims of financial fraud. They were prisoners in a sophisticated psychological prison designed to extract their wealth while maintaining the illusion of voluntary participation. Samantha was arrested at the compound while conducting what she called an advanced optimization session with Jonathan. When agents entered the room, they found Jonathan in a dissociative state, repeating phrases about peak performance and optimal living, while Samantha guided him through exercises designed to reinforce his dependence on her approval. The rescue of the compound residents was complicated by their genuine belief that they were participating in beneficial personal development programs. Many initially refused to leave, insisting that the FBI was interfering with their optimization journey. Several required deprogramming therapy to help them recognize the extent of their psychological manipulation. Jonathan's recovery was particularly difficult because he'd been under Samantha's influence longer than most residents. It took months of therapy for him to begin recognizing how completely his judgment had been compromised. He struggled with intense shame about the decisions he'd made while under Samantha's control, particularly his treatment of his wife and brother. "I genuinely believed I was becoming a better person," Jonathan told investigators during his testimony. "Samantha convinced me that my family was holding me back from achieving my potential. I thought I was making rational, data-driven decisions about my life, but she had programmed every aspect of my decision-making process." Samantha's trial lasted 8 months and exposed the sophisticated psychological techniques she'd used to control her victims. Prosecutors brought in experts on cult psychology, financial coercion, and psychological manipulation to explain how Samantha had weaponized personal development concepts to create a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. The prosecution presented evidence of systematic psychological abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Samantha had not only stolen billions of dollars from her victims, but had eliminated 3 individuals who threatened to expose her operation. Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychologist who testified about cult indoctrination techniques, described Samantha's system as perhaps the most sophisticated financial cult in modern history. "The defendant didn't just steal money," Dr. Chen explained to the jury. "She systematically destroyed her victim's ability to think independently, judge reality accurately, or maintain relationships outside her control. She turned personal development into a weapon against the very people seeking to improve their lives." Samantha showed no remorse during the trial, maintaining that she had provided valuable services to clients who had paid voluntarily for her expertise. She argued that her methods were simply advanced applications of legitimate optimization techniques, and that her clients had achieved unprecedented levels of personal performance under her guidance. "I helped these individuals transcend the limitations of conventional thinking," Samantha told the court during her testimony. "They achieved levels of focus, efficiency, and performance that would have been impossible within traditional social structures. The fact that this required significant lifestyle changes doesn't make it criminal." But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Recorded conversations showed her explicitly planning to isolate clients from their families and extract their wealth. Financial records revealed systematic theft disguised as program fees. Most damning were her personal notes documenting the psychological manipulation techniques she used to maintain control over her victims. Samantha was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and second-degree murder in the deaths of 3 former clients. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her victims faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding their lives after years of psychological conditioning. Many had lost their businesses, their families, and their ability to trust their own judgment. Several required extensive therapy to recover from the psychological damage of their time under Samantha's control. The case led to increased scrutiny of the life coaching and personal development industries, with new regulations requiring transparency in coaching methods and financial arrangements. Consumer protection agencies began investigating other high-fee coaching programs that showed similar patterns of isolation and financial extraction. In her prison cell, Samantha sometimes thought about optimization, real optimization, genuine improvement, the kind of personal development that had originally interested her in human psychology. She remembered the satisfaction she'd felt early in her career when she'd helped clients overcome obstacles and achieve meaningful goals. That satisfaction felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of manipulation and greed that had twisted her knowledge of human psychology into tools for exploitation and control. She'd started coaching because she wanted to help successful people achieve their full potential. She'd ended up destroying dozens of lives because she'd found a way to profit from their desire for improvement. Samantha's victims struggled to rebuild their trust in themselves and others. Many avoided any form of coaching or self-improvement programs, too traumatized by their experiences to risk manipulation again. The personal development industry as a whole faced increased skepticism from consumers who had learned how therapeutic techniques could be weaponized for exploitation. Late at night in her cell, Samantha sometimes wondered about the people she'd controlled. Had they been able to rebuild their relationships with their families? Had they recovered their ability to make independent decisions? Had she permanently damaged their capacity for trust and personal growth? She thought about Jonathan Weber, who had lost his marriage, his relationship with his brother, and his business empire while believing he was becoming a better person. Jonathan, whose only crime had been wanting to optimize his potential and live a more meaningful life. Samantha had wanted to help people transcend their limitations, but her quest for control over others had ultimately trapped her in a prison of her own making, alone in a cell where she would spend the rest of her life thinking about the personal growth she'd weaponized into instruments of exploitation and destruction. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this, some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.